Hello everyone, today we're going to be going over circulation of blood, which is chapter 30 of your text. These are our learning objectives. So discuss the physical principles that govern fluid flow and circulation. Discuss how arterial blood pressure is influenced by cardiac output, stroke volume, peripheral resistance, vasomotor, presoreflex, and chemoreflex control mechanisms. All right, so this is basically, again, we're talking about the cardiovascular system, and we've already discussed the heart and we've already discussed the blood vessels. So now, in general, we're going to be talking about the system overall. So the cardiovascular system is like our body's transport system. Again, its job is to move blood around the body and also deliver oxygen and nutrients to our organs and tissues. In addition to the delivery, it's also responsible for removing waste like carbon dioxide in order to keep us healthy. So this process basically helps our body maintain homeostasis. So it's staying balanced and it's also working properly. So the body has these built-in controls to help adjust blood flow depending on what we have going on. So our heart basically will beat faster when we are doing things such as exercise and running, and that's to bring more oxygen to our muscles. And the blood vessels will tighten or relax in order to control blood pressure. So hormones like adrenaline will make our heart beat faster when we're excited or also scared. So we're talking about sometimes that fight or flight response. So again, these adjustments help to make sure that every part of our body is getting what it needs in order to function properly. So the reason why this is important, or why is it important? So if our blood flow were to stop or slow down, that means that parts of our body won't be getting enough oxygen, and if it's not getting enough oxygen, it's not going to be able to work properly. So this can cause us to have serious problems like fainting, numbness, or even things such as organ failure. So that's why keeping a healthy heart and also blood vessels is important for our overall health. Now we're going to discuss hemodynamics. And hemodynamics is just a fancy word to describe basically how blood moves through the body. So basically, the heart, the blood vessels, and blood pressure all work together to keep that blood flow moving smoothly. So blood flow changes all the time, again, depending on what our body needs. So again, the blood moves faster when we're doing things such as exercising, and then it moves slower when we're doing things such as sleeping. So the reason why blood circulation is important is because our body needs different amounts of blood in different situations. For example, muscles need more blood during exercise to get oxygen. The brain needs a steady blood flow so that we can think and stay awake. So again, if blood flow stops or slows down too much, it can cause us to have some serious health problems. So the way that the body controls blood flow is it has built-in systems that control that blood flow in two main ways. So it keeps the circulation going so blood doesn't stop moving, and it also adjusts the amount of blood depending on the needs of the body at that time. Just a little bit of background on the hemodynamics experiment. So William Harvey, who was a scientist in the 1600s, he discovered how blood circulates in the body. So his work was critical for us to understand the role of the heart and also the blood vessels. So what his experiment was about was he wanted to prove that blood moves in a one-way circuit through the body, pumped by the heart. So back then, people thought that blood randomly moved or was used up by the body. So he conducted a simple experiment to show how the veins have valves that only allow that blood to flow in one direction. So how he did it was he had a volunteer extend their arm and squeeze a pole. as you can see in this image here. He pressed on their vein and noticed that blood moved in one direction, which was toward the heart. So when he pushed on the vein below a valve, the blood stopped, proving that valves prevent backflow. And this showed that blood wasn't used up, but instead it circulates continuously. So the reason why this experiment was important, because it helped us prove that the heart is actually a pump that keeps blood moving in a loop. It also explained how veins work and why their valves keep blood from flowing backwards. So it was a huge breakthrough in medicine, leading to modern heart and also circulation research. Now we're going to focus on the primary principle of circulation. So basically, blood flows because of pressure differences in our circulatory system, and this follows Newton's law of motion, which explains how objects move. So the heart basically creates pressure that pushes that blood through the body. So the key concepts are that blood moves due to pressure differences. So blood always flows from high pressure, which is P1, to low pressure. So example is blood moves from the left ventricle, which has high pressure, to the right atrium, which has low pressure. So what a pressure gradient is, it is basically a difference in pressure between 2 points. So the larger the difference, the faster that blood flows. In terms of perfusion pressure, this is the pressure that's needed to push blood into our tissues. So if perfusion pressure is too low, tissues won't get enough oxygen and nutrients. If perfusion pressure is too high, it can damage our blood vessels. So the reason why this principle is important is because it explains why blood keeps moving and how doctors are able to measure blood flow. So problems with pressure gradients can cause poor circulation as well as high blood pressure or even shock in some instances. So in a nutshell, blood circulation depends on pressure differences. So the heart basically acts as a pump, and blood always flows from high to low pressure to keep the body working properly. Now here's our visual of pressure gradient. So we said that blood moves because of pressure differences between the heart and also the rest of the body. So this pressure gradually decreases as blood flows from the large arteries to our small veins. So again, the heart is acting like a pump to push that blood through our circulatory system. So starting on the left, when we're looking at this graph, on the left hand side you can see that blood pressure is measured in millimeters of mercury. So from left to right, we will see how pressure drops in the blood vessels. So we start off with the aorta, which is here, and blood leaves the heart with high force, typically around 120 millimeters of mercury during systole. So next, it shows our large arteries and also the small arteries. So pressure remains high, but it does start to drop as blood moves further down. When we get to the arterioles and also the capillaries, you'll notice that there is a bigger drop or a big drop in pressure, because arterioles, they control blood flow, and capillaries have a very low pressure, around 35 millimeters of mercury. All right, and then as you can see, as it's going from venules to veins, that's when we're seeing the lowest pressure. So basically blood slows down and it returns to the heart with almost no pressure, approximately 5 to 10 millimeters of mercury. So the diagram on the right, which is the water tank analogy right here, is basically the tank represents the heart, and it's pushing fluid, which is blood, through a tube, which would be representative of our arteries and veins. So the pressure starts very high at the top, and it gets lower, as you can see, it gets lower as it's flowing out. So in terms of resistance, narrower blood vessels are going to slow down that flow, just like how that smaller pipe would reduce water flow. So the key takeaways are that blood flows from high pressure to low pressure, just like water in pipes. Arterioles control resistance, which acts or affects how fast or how slow blood moves. And by the time that blood reaches our veins, pressure is very low, and the heart must pump again in order to restart that circulation for us. So again, this slide just explains why blood moves, and that's because of those pressure differences, and the heart creates that driving force, and blood slows down as it reaches our smaller vessels. So understanding these pressure gradients just basically helps us diagnose blood pressure problems, and it also helps keep circulation working efficiently. So arterial blood pressure basically depends on how much blood is inside of our arteries, and the heart's pumping speed, which is the cardiac output, basically controls this. So understanding blood pressure helps us again diagnose some heart issues that a person may be having. So blood pressure is how much force the blood is applying on our artery wall. So the main factor that affects blood pressure, again, is how much blood is in the arteries. So if more blood is in the arteries, our blood pressure goes up. If there's less blood in the arteries, pressure goes down. So in terms of cardiac output, that's the amount of blood the heart pumps out per minute, and we measure that in milliliters per minute or liters per minute. So again, just a visual for you on what blood pressure is. If you were to think of your arteries like a garden hose, if you turn on the water full blast, the pressure inside of the hose would be high. If you turn down that pressure if you turn the water down, or the speed of the water down, the pressure inside the hose drops. So your heart is like the faucet and your arteries are like the hose. So what things affects our pressure? Basically, more blood in the arteries is going to affect the pressure. So if we have more blood in the arteries, we have a higher blood pressure. Again, if we have less blood in the arteries, we have a lower blood pressure. In terms of cardiac output, it basically tells us how much blood the heart is pumping per minute. So if the heart pumps more blood, the pressure increases. If the heart pumps less blood, the pressure decreases. So some real world examples of when blood pressure would increase and decrease. During exercise, when we are running, the heart pumps more blood, therefore our blood pressure is going to increase. And things such as maybe you're dehydrated, or maybe you have blood loss. With dehydration, we have less blood volume that leads to a lower blood pressure. In terms of blood loss, if someone is losing blood, their blood pressure is going to drop, maybe even drop quickly. All right, so this is your explanation of arterial blood pressure and cardiac output. So now we're looking at how blood volume affects blood pressure in our arteries. So we already discussed that arterial blood pressure depends on how much blood is in the arteries and basically how fast it flows in and out. So several factors are going to influence this. That's including stroke volume, the heart rate, blood viscosity, and also arterial diameter. So if more blood enters the arteries than leaves, then blood volume is going to increase and pressure is going to rise. If more blood leaves than enters, then blood volume and pressure are going to drop. So just breaking down this chart here. So we're going to say that more blood enters arteries. We have a higher blood volume, and with that we have increased pressure. So when we look at stroke volume, which is the amount of blood pumped per heartbeat, that goes up and more blood enters. If we look at heart rate, if heart rate increases, that means that we have more beats per minute, which means more blood enters. In terms of cardiac output, that equals that more blood is being pushed into the arteries per minute. And in terms of let's say we have less blood leaving the arteries, then that means that we have higher blood volume and increased blood pressure. All right, in terms of blood viscosity, all right, blood viscosity increases. That means that blood is thicker and it's harder to flow, which means that blood is going to stay in the arteries. All right, and what this means for peripheral resistance, that means that it's going to increase. All right, and we'll have narrow arteries, and that means that blood flow is going to slow down and pressure is going to rise. In terms of arterial diameter decreasing, meaning we have vasoconstriction going on, that means that less blood is going to be allowed to exit. So blood pressure basically rises when more blood enters than more blood leaves. So blood that is thicker or higher in viscosity and arteries that are narrower due to vasoconstriction are going to cause this rise in blood pressure. All right, so again, think of blood pressure again like that water hose we discussed about earlier. If water, which we'll say is blood, enters the hose, which are our vessels, then if more water enters the holes than leaves, then we have pressure buildup. If that hose gets more narrow, we're talking about vasoconstriction there, then the pressure is also going to increase because less water can get out or get through. If water is thicker, let's say like a syrup instead of water, is going to move slower, and that's also going to raise pressure as well. So the key takeaways is heart rate and stroke volume control how much blood enters our arteries. Resistance in terms of thickness of the blood and also the artery width are going to control how much blood is allowed to leave. So when more blood stays in the arteries, we know that blood pressure is going to rise. If blood exits quickly, then we know that blood pressure is going to lower. All right, so this slide again basically connects how heart function in terms of blood flow and blood pressure, as well as keeping arteries open and blood flowing smoothly, are critical and key for our health. So this slide basically illustrates cardiac output for us, which is the amount of blood pumped by the heart per minute, and it shows the flow of blood through the pulmonary circulation system and also the systemic circulation system and how blood is distributed to our different organs. So if we break down this chart, total cardiac output is about 5,000 milliliters per minute. So we're talking about 5 liters per minute of blood is being pumped by our heart. That same volume must be returned in order to maintain our circulation. So if we're looking at the pulmonary circulation, which is on the left side, the blue side, we're talking about blood being returned from the body to the heart. We call that venous return. That blood is low in oxygen and also high in carbon dioxide. So the right heart, or the right side of the heart, pumps it to the lungs for oxygenation. So pressure in the pulmonary circulating system or circulation system is low. All right, if we're looking at it, it's about 15 millimeters of mercury in the lungs and about 4 millimeters of mercury returning to the heart. All right, on the right side, or the systemic circulation system, the red side, this is the left heart pumping, or the left side of the heart pumping. All right, we already know it's pumping that oxygenated blood to the body, and it is under great pressure. So the pressure in the arteries leaving the heart is very high. So here we're saying approximately 104 millimeters of mercury, and that's going to ensure proper circulation. So the blood is then distributed to the different organs based on their needs. So in terms of blood distribution to the organs in millimeters of mercury per minute, the brain receives 700 milliliters per minute. The heart, or the coronary circulation, receives about 225 milliliters per minute. Our kidneys receive 1,000 milliliters per minute, and that's important for filtering the blood. The GI system, meaning our digestive system or digestive organs, receive 1,250 milliliters per minute. The skeletal muscles receive 1,450 milliliters per minute. That can be higher during exercise, and the skin receives 375 milliliters per minute, and that's going to vary based on temperature regulation. So again, cardiac output, we're talking about the blood being pumped by the heart per minute, 5,000 milliliters per minute. The pulmonary circulation is going to send that blood to the lungs for oxygenation, and the systemic circulation is going to send that oxygenated rich blood to our body's organs. So organs receive different amounts of blood based on the function and also the demand. So blood pressure is highest when leaving the heart. So again, 104 millimeters of mercury, and it's lowest when returning. All right, that's about 4 millimeters of mercury. So a real world connection here. During exercise, we see increases in blood flow to our skeletal muscles and also the heart. In times of shock or dehydration, we see a reduction in cardiac output, meaning that blood pressure will be lowered. And in hot weather versus cold weather, our skin blood flow increases in heat to help cool the body down, and it decreases in cold weather to help conserve heat. Now, this slide is explaining how cardiac output is determined and basically how it can change in response to different factors. So, cardiac output is the amount of blood that the heart is pumping per minute, and it depends on two key factors, and that's stroke volume and also heart rate. So, stroke volume is the amount of blood being pumped by our heart per heartbeat, and heart rate is the number of beats per minute. So the formula for cardiac output is, cardiac output, which is measured in volume per minute, is stroke volume divided by heart rate. All right, and this means that if either stroke volume or heart rate increases, that means that the cardiac output is also going to increase. So if we talk about something called fixed formula, in medical practice, cardiac output is often calculated using fixed formula, which considers oxygen consumption and blood oxygen levels to determine cardiac output more precisely. So how changes in heart rate and stroke volume affect cardiac output is if heart rate increases, then cardiac output increases as well. If stroke volume increases, then cardiac output increases. So if either heart rate or stroke volume decreases, then of course cardiac output is going to decrease. So during exercise, both heart rate and stroke volume increase, which will boost the cardiac output in order to supply more oxygen and blood to our muscles. Cardiac reserve is like an extra capacity of our heart to pump blood above that resting cardiac output. So this allows the body to basically adjust to physical activity or stress by increasing that cardiac output when it's needed. So again, cardiac output is referring to how much blood the heart pumps in 1 minute. And those two key factors that determine cardiac output are stroke volume, which is how much blood the heart pumps per beat, and heart rate, which is how many beats per minute. All right, the formula again for cardiac output is stroke volume stroke volume times heart rate. All right, so simply, if we're explaining it, if heart rate increases during exercise or stress, that means that the cardiac output is going to increase. If stroke volume increases, meaning our heart is pumping more blood per beat, then the cardiac output is also going to increase. As likewise, if any of those factors decrease, that means that cardiac output will also decrease. So in a clinical setting, doctors use fixed formula to measure cardiac output accurately by considering oxygen consumption. So again, the heart also has a reserve capacity called cardiac reserve, and this is the extra blood the heart can pump when it's needed, such as during strenuous exercise. So a person's resting cardiac output might be 5 liters per minute, but during exercise it can increase up to 4 to 5 times that amount. So in terms of real world application, athletes have higher cardiac reserves, and the reason for that is their hearts are more efficient at pumping blood. People with heart failure have a lower cardiac reserve because their hearts struggle to pump more blood when it's needed. So medications like beta blockers, if we're talking about medications, they lower the heart rate. So they reduce the cardiac output to help manage things such as blood pressure. Let's look at some of the factors that affect stroke volume. Again, stroke volume, we're talking about the amount of blood that's ejected from the heart with each beat. So one of the most important factors that influence stroke volume is Starling's law of the heart, also known as Frank-Starling mechanism. So basically in Frank-Starling's mechanism, he stated that the more the heart muscle fibers are stretched before contraction, the stronger the contraction is going to be. So the heart automatically adjusts its force of contraction based on the amount of blood filling it. So we're talking about the preload. So it's similar to a rubber band. The more we stretch it before letting go, the stronger it's going to snap back. So preload and stretching heart fibers, which mean when we're referring to preload is basically the amount of blood in the heart at the end of diastole. So when the heart is relaxed and it fills with blood. So if we have more blood filling the heart, that means that we're going to have more stretch on the fibers, so we're going to have a stronger contraction. So this ensures that the heart pumps out as much blood as it receives, and that's going to assist in maintaining balance in circulation. Heart versus mechanical pump. So unlike a mechanical pump that pushes out a fixed amount of fluid, the heart is able to adjust its output to match the volume that it receives. So again, this is going to ensure an efficient and balanced circulation, preventing fluid backup in the brain. So again, stroke volume and Starling's law is basically what affects, we're talking about what affects stroke volume, which is the amount of blood that's pumped with each heartbeat. And again, this principle is stated in Starling's law, which explains how the heart adjusts its force with each contraction. All right, again, I gave you the analogy of the rubber band. So think of the heart like a rubber band. The more it stretches, the stronger it's able to snap back. So when more blood fills the heart muscles stretch more, leading to a stronger contraction. Preload, again, we're talking about the amount of blood in the heart just before it contracts. So more preload means that the heart is being stretched more, so we're going to have a stronger heartbeat. This image visually shows us what Starling's law of the heart is talking about. So Starling's law, again, it tells us that the more the heart muscle is stretched by incoming blood, the stronger its contraction is going to be, but up to a certain limit. So on the bottom, or the x-axis, it shows us ventricular volume at the end of diastole, which means how much blood is in the heart before it contracts. On the y-axis on the left, it shows us the stroke volume. So basically, the amount of blood that's pumped out of the heart per beat. All right, the curve that we're looking at basically shows us that as that ventricular volume increases, which is here, stroke volume also increases, meaning that the heart pumps harder when it's filled with more blood. Now we do have a plateau there. So basically, after a certain point, adding more blood is not going to increase that stroke volume. So meaning the heart does reach its limit eventually, and it cannot stay or cannot stretch any further. So again, this illustration right here basically shows us or highlights how blood filling in the heart, how blood is filling in the heart and then being pumped out. So it demonstrates how increased filling or the preload leads to that stronger contraction. All right, and the reason why Starling's law matters to us, or why it should matter to us, because it kind of helps us understand why fluid levels in the body are able to impact our heart function. So too little blood equals a weak contraction. Too much blood can equal a risk of overloading our heart. So again, this law basically also can tell us how athletes have stronger heartbeats because they train their heart to pump more efficiently by filling it and stretching it daily as they're exercising. So we're continuing our discussion about stroke volume, but now we're focusing on contractility, which is the strength of that heart contraction. Contractility is influenced by chemical factors like either chemical factors that either strengthen or weaken the heart's ability to pump that blood. So we have the neural and we also have the endocrine influence. So these are two major chemicals that affect contractility. So in terms of the neural factor, which is norepinephrine, which is released by the sympathetic nervous system, that hormone increases heart contraction strength. And in terms of the endocrine factor, which is epinephrine, that is released from the adrenal gland, and that hormone also enhances heart contraction. So both norepinephrine and epinephrine are triggered by things such as stress, exercise, emergency situations, etc., and they help the heart pump more forcefully. All right, in terms of ejection fraction, all right, that is basically how measures how efficiently the heart pumps the blood. So ejection fraction is the ratio of stroke volume to in diastole volume, EDV. So basically how much blood the heart pumps out compared to how much it initially fills with. So again, that is your formula. I like for it to look like this. Jeez, it's not writing for me. All right, times 100 on this side. That's how I like to look at it. So a normal ejection fraction is approximately 55% or higher, meaning the heart pumps out at least 55% of the blood that it receives per beat. Now, the reason why ejection fraction is important because it's an indicator of heart function. If the ejection fraction drops below 50%, it can signal that heart failure is going on. So as the myocardium, which is a heart muscle, weakens, ejection fraction also decreases because the heart loses its ability to pump efficiently. So the key takeaways are stronger heart contractions equal higher stroke volume. Also, stress and exercise are going to increase that contractility via the norepinephrine and the epinephrine. And in terms of ejection fraction, it's a measure of heart efficiency. Lower ejection fractions can signal to us as healthcare providers that there might be some sort of heart disease going on in the patient. All right, this slide basically shows us stroke volume and how it is affected by that contractility, specifically when we're talking about the role of epinephrine in increasing the stroke volume. So in diagram A, which is the top one, we have what we call a normal stroke volume. So it represents a normal heart rate, a normal heart without any extra stimulation. So in diastolic volume, which is here, this is the amount of blood in our ventricle before contraction. And then we have the end systolic volume, or the ESV, in red over here. So this is the amount of blood left in the ventricle after contraction, shown in red. Now, again, stroke volume is EDV, which is the end diastolic volume, minus the end systolic volume. So the heart pumps some blood out, but not all of it is going to leave. It does leave behind some. All right. That is what is left behind. So the normal, that was the volume at the end. So the normal contractility basically means that the heart pumps an expected amount of blood. All right. Now on the bottom here, we're looking at increased stroke volume as a result of epinephrine. So again, it shows us the effect of epinephrine. We know that's a hormone that increases the heart contractility. So with epinephrine, the ventricles contract more forcefully. So that ESV decreases, all right, because less blood is left in the ventricle after contraction. So stroke volume actually increases, meaning that more blood is pumped out when the epinephrine is involved. So again, important during exercise and stress, when the body needs more oxygenated blood, that stroke volume is increased. So again, stroke volume is the amount of blood that the heart pumps with each beat, and it depends on how much blood the heart fills with, which is the EDV, versus how much is left behind after contraction, which is the ESV. All right, and we talked about what these diagrams mean. So SV is equal to EDV minus ESV. All right, so basically, in a nutshell, if we're stimulated by epinephrine, it's going to increase contractility, making that heart pump harder and more efficiently. All right, and this is going to lead to a lower ESV, meaning less blood is left in the heart, and a higher SV, or higher stroke volume, meaning more blood is pumped out, which is very much essential when and during times of exercise and also stress. Now we're basically expanding on stroke volume and also the factors influencing it, especially the end diastolic volume, which is the EDV, which is the amount of blood in the ventricle before contraction, end systolic volume, which is the ESV, which is the amount of blood left in the ventricle after contraction, and also contractility and epinephrine. Basically, how stronger heart contraction will increase that stroke volume. So in diagram C, again, we're looking at normal stroke volume with increased EDV. So the diagram shows the effect of Frank-Starling mechanism on stroke volume. So EDV is increased, meaning more blood fills the ventricle because of Starling's law. A fuller heart stretches the muscle fibers, leading to a stronger contraction. ESV remains normal, but since more blood entered initially, we do have a higher EDV, so the stroke volume is increased. All right, so the key concept is if we have more blood entering the heart, or a higher EDV, that's going to equal to a stronger contraction and also a higher stroke volume. And the illustration D at the bottom, we're showing increased stroke volume with epinephrine. So basically it shows the role of epinephrine, which is basically adrenaline, in increasing that stroke volume. So we have a higher EDV present, meaning more blood is filling the heart. So that means that contractility is boosted by epinephrine, meaning the heart is going to pump more forcefully. And less blood is going to remain in the heart afterwards. So we're going to have a lower ESV. So stroke volume is increased even further. So with epinephrine, the heart pumps more forcefully, reducing that ESV and increasing the overall stroke volume. So in a nutshell, stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped by the heart with each beat. Again, it's determined by how much blood fills the ventricle before contraction, which is the EDV, and how much is left behind after the contraction, which is the ESV. Diagram C was just explaining Starling's law to it, which basically says when more blood fills the heart muscle is going to stretch more, and that stretch is going to lead to a stronger contraction, meaning it's going to pump out more blood and increase the stroke volume. So again, that's called Frank Starling's mechanism, which means more blood in, more blood out. And last but not least, diagram D is just showing us epinephrine's effect again. So in the second diagram, we add epinephrine, which makes the heart contract even harder, and this reduces the amount of blood left after contraction, so it lowers the ESV. So with higher EDV and also lower ESV, stroke volume increases even more. So this happens when the body needs more blood flow, like during exercise or even stress. So the key takeaways here are a fuller heart, higher EDV, contracts stronger and pumps more blood, meaning you have a higher stroke volume. And then epinephrine helps the heart squeeze harder, reducing leftover blood, so you have a lower ESV. So the combination of both of these leads to the highest stroke volume, improving the patient's circulation. All right, now we're looking at a concept called afterload. So afterload basically refers to the force that the heart has to work against in order to push blood into the artery. So it represents the resistance that left ventricle has to overcome in order to eject blood into the aorta. So basically, if we're breaking down these two bullet points, higher afterload equals lower stroke volume. So if the heart has to work harder to pump the blood out due to reasons such as maybe they have narrowed or stiff arteries, then less blood is going to be pushed forward. All right, this is going to reduce the stroke volume, and it's going to make the heart work less efficiently. So over time, if we're having a high afterload for a long time, after that afterload remains high for a long time due to conditions such as hypertension or atherosclerosis, the heart is going to pump harder, so it has to work a lot harder. Over time, the heart is going to become stressed and weaken as a result, and that could lead to the person having heart failure. So analogy wise, if we think of a garden hose, if the nozzle is wide open, the water is going to flow out easily and we have a low afterload. But if the nozzle is partially closed, that water pressure is going to build up and making it harder for that water to flow out, and we call that a higher afterload. So this is what happens in the heart when the arteries are narrowed or too tight. So it's harder to push the blood through, and that reduces the overall efficiency. So low afterload equals easier blood flow, better stroke volume. High afterload equals the heart works harder and stroke volume decreases. If we have chronically high afterloads, that could lead to heart failure. Now let's focus on cardiac presoreflexes. Presoreflexes are automatic reflex responses that help regulate blood pressure by adjusting the heart rate and also the blood vessel size. So they rely on baroreceptors, which are basically special sensors in the aorta and also the carotid arteries to detect changes in that blood pressure. So the aortic baroreceptors are in the aorta, and of course the carotid baroreceptors are in the carotid sinus. So they continuously monitor blood pressure and they send signals to the brain when changes in pressure occur. So basically, the baroreceptors communicate with the autonomic cardiac control center in the brain, and this center then activates our parasympathetic or sympathetic nervous system depending on whether blood pressure is either too high or too low. So if blood pressure is too high, meaning we have hypertension, the baroreceptors will send signals to slow the heart rate down. The parasympathetic system is then activated, heart rate slows down, and our blood vessels relax. So basically the blood pressure goes down at that point. If blood pressure is too low, meaning the person has hypotension, the baroreceptors will trigger a faster heart rate and vasoconstriction will occur. That sympathetic system will then be activated, the heartbeats will come faster, or the heart will beat faster, the blood vessels will tighten, and the person's blood pressure will rise. So again, think of baroreceptors like thermostats for our blood pressure. If our house gets too hot, meaning the body is too hot, or the blood pressure is too high, the thermostat is going to turn on the AC and cool things down. If it gets too cold, it's going to turn on the heat. So that's how the baroreceptors detect pressure changes and tell the body how to respond. So baroreceptors help maintain that stable blood pressure. They communicate with the autonomic nervous system to adjust the heart rate and also the vessel size. So this process basically ensures that we have proper circulation, and it prevents us from having extreme blood pressure changes. Now we're looking at an image that basically is illustrating how those baroreceptors, which we said those were the pressure sensors in the cardiovascular system, are going to help regulate that blood pressure. So some of the key structures that are listed in this diagram are the aortic baroreceptors. So basically the aorta is located in the aortic arch here. All right, aortic arch. And it detects changes in the blood pressure that's leaving the heart. So it sends a signal via the vagus nerve, all right, which is the cranial nerve 10, to the brain stem. All right, in terms of the carotid baroreceptors, we have the carotid sinus, which is here. All right, and it's located in the carotid arteries, which are the major arteries that supply the blood to our brain. So it monitors that blood pressure going to the brain, and it sends a signal via the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is located here, and also which is cranial nerve 9, and also the carotid branch, which is the nerve of hearing, which is here. And in terms of the brain stem itself, we consider that to be the cardiac control center. So that is the brain stem. And it receives the input from these baroreceptors, and it adjusts the heart rate and also the blood vessel diameter to maintain the body's homeostasis. So again, the baroreceptors are those specialized pressure sensors in the aorta and also the carotid arteries. They detect changes in the blood pressure, and they send those signals to the brain to help maintain a stable circulatory system. So again, if blood pressure rises, the baroreceptors signal the brain to slow the heart rate and relax the blood vessels. And if the blood pressure drops, they signal the brain to increase the heart rate and constrict the blood vessels. This image basically shows us the baroreceptor reflex. So again, it's that mechanism that helps maintain that stable blood pressure for us. The process basically follows a feedback loop where those baroreceptors in the carotid sinus and also the aortic arch detect the change in the blood pressure, and they send the signal to the brainstem to adjust the heart rate and also the vascular resistance. So when we look at this diagram, we can look at blood pressure disturbance. So the blood pressure disturbance occurs here. We see a horse rider, and the disturbance is that the horse sees the snake there on the ground. So the horse represents the blood pressure for us. If the rider pulls back on the reins, which is the baroreceptors, it's going to signal it to slow down. If the rider lets go, it's going to signal it to speed up. So the sensors again are the baroreceptors. So in terms of the aortic arch baroreceptors, they detect that the change in the blood pressure in the systemic circulation system, so the entire body. And then the carotid baroreceptors are going to detect blood pressure changes in the brain. So the signal transmission then occurs via the cranial nerves. Cranial nerve 9, which is the glossopharyngeal nerve, sends a signal to the carotid sinus of the brain, and cranial nerve 10, which is the vagus nerve, is going to send a signal from the aortic arch to the brain. So we see that the nerves are now sending a signal. All right, so that signal is going to be sent then to the integrator. So basically the brain stem, specifically the medulla oblongata, is going to process that message or that signal and determine what adjustments need to be made at that time. So it acts kind of like a control center that decides how to adjust the heart rate and also how to, in what manner to constrict our vessels. All right, after it decides that, we move on to the effector phase. So that's when the heart and the SA node are going to kick in. So if the blood pressure is too high, the signals are sent to this to slow the SA node, which is going to decrease the heart rate. So hyperpolarization of that cardiac muscle is going to prevent that overcontraction. And this is basically a continuous feedback loop, and it needs to happen in order for our blood pressure to remain stable. The carotid sinus reflex also helps regulate blood pressure, especially in the brain. So this reflex is basically a component of our automatic blood pressure control system. So the location of the carotid sinus is basically it's found in the base of the internal carotid artery. So it's just above where it branches off from the common carotid artery. And the location is important because it allows the body to monitor our blood pressure before it reaches the brain. So basically that carotid sinus contains baroreceptors, which are sensors that detect changes in blood pressure. So if blood pressure again it rises, these receptors send a signal to the brain to slow the heart rate down and lower the blood pressure. If the blood pressure drops, they signal the brain to speed up the heart rate and constrict the blood vessels to increase that blood pressure. So that sensory information from that carotid sinus is then carried through the carotid sinus nerve, and it's a branch of that glossopharyngeal nerve, which is cranial nerve number 9. The signals go to the carotid control center in the medulla oblongata, which processes that information and determines the next action. In terms of the parasympathetic response via that vagus nerve, when that blood pressure is too high, the medulla oblongata sends parasympathetic impulses through the vagus nerve, which is cranial nerve 10, and these signals slow down the SA node, which reduces the heart rate and lowers the blood pressure. All right, the aortic reflex also plays a major role in controlling blood pressure by reducing the heart rate when our pressure is too high. So it works together with that carotid sinus reflex to ensure that blood pressure is regulated throughout our entire body. So basically what happens is, again, it's another controlling measure for blood pressure. The reflex helps regulate the heart rate and the blood pressure by detecting changes in blood pressure within the aortic arch. So the aortic arch again contains those baroreceptors, which are specialized pressure sensors. The baroreceptors detect changes in the blood pressure and send those signals to the brain when the pressure is too high or too low. All right, the sensory signals from those baroreceptors travel along the aortic nerve, which joins that vagus nerve, which is cranial nerve number 10, and these signals terminate in the cardiac control center of the medulla oblongata of our brain. If the pressure increases, the baroreceptors send more signals to the cardiac control center, and this triggers that parasympathetic nervous system via that vagus nerve to slow down the heart rate and decrease the blood pressure. So this response is known as vagal inhibition, which helps maintain our stable blood pressure. So comparison to the carotid sinus reflex, the aortic reflex is similar, but instead of monitoring blood pressure near the brain, this one monitors the blood pressure directly at the heart's exit point. So it ensures that blood pressure remains stable throughout the entire body, not just the brain. Now let's look at some other reflexes that influence our heart rate. So heart rate is not just controlled by physical activity or blood pressure. Emotions, temperature, and other external stimuli also play a role. So in terms of emotions and heart rate, the brain, particularly the hypothalamus, can influence the heart rate based on emotions. For example, when you experience anxiety or fear or anger, your heart rate increases. On the other hand, during moments when you're grieving or you're feeling sad, the heart rate is going to decrease. Exercise, of course, physical activity is always going to be a natural stimulator of heart rate. So when you exercise, your muscles are demanding more oxygen and nutrients, which causes the heart to pump faster to meet those needs. And temperature is also a factor of our heart rate. So in times when we're in warm temperatures, when our blood temperature rises on a hot day, or maybe we have a fever, the body responds by increasing our heart rate. This is because the heat dilates those blood vessels, requiring the heart to pump more blood to maintain circulation and also cool the body down. Where when we're in cold weather or cold temperatures, when the body temperature drops or when we're exposed to the cold, our heart rate is going to decrease. And it decreases because it's trying to help conserve heat and also help conserve energy by slowing down the circulation. So if you ever notice when your heart is racing, when you're scared or you're nervous, that's your sympathetic nervous system increasing your heart rate as part of our fight or flight response. If you've ever been outside on a cold day, you might have felt a little sluggish. That's because our heart rate has slowed down to try to preserve some of our energy and some of that body heat. And last but not least, when you exercise, you notice that your heart rate rises, and that's to keep up with your muscles' oxygen demand. So these are some other stimuli that can influence your heart rate. And this slide talks about peripheral resistance. So peripheral resistance is the resistance that our blood faces as it moves through our vessels. So again, think of it like water flowing through a hose. If the hose is wide, the water usually flows very easily. But if the hose is narrow, then there's more resistance to the flow. So basically, peripheral resistance, we're talking about the friction between the blood and the walls of our blood vessels. This resistance affects how easily or how difficult that blood is going to be able to move through our body. So some factors that influence peripheral resistance are going to be blood viscosity. So we're talking about how thick the blood is, and viscosity, if the blood is too thick or too viscous due to maybe the person has a high red blood cell count or they're dehydrated, resistance is going to increase and it's going to make the heart work harder. If the blood is too thin, resistance is going to decrease and the blood is going to flow more easily. Diameter of our arterioles, the smaller arteries, are also a factor that affects peripheral resistance. So basically the size of the arterioles. So narrow arterioles let's say in terms of vasoconstriction, are going to increase resistance, making it harder for the blood to flow. And that's going to in turn raise that person's blood pressure. And wider arterioles in terms of vasodilation are going to decrease the resistance and allow the blood to flow more freely, thus lowering the blood pressure. So again, when we're cold, your blood vessels are going to narrow or vasoconstrict, increasing the resistance and making our blood pressure rise. During exercise, our blood vessels are going to widen, or vasodilation is happening, and that's going to allow more blood to flow to our muscles. So conditions like high cholesterol and also plaque buildup can narrow those arteries, and if our arteries narrow, they increase the resistance within the vessels, and it causes that person to have high blood pressure. So peripheral resistance is an important factor when it comes to regulating blood pressure and also regulating circulation. It's controlled by blood viscosity and also the diameter of our blood vessels as well. This slide is basically trying to explain blood viscosity. So we're talking about the thickness or the stickiness of our blood. All right, we already learned that viscosity is going to affect how easily blood is going to flow through our vessels and how much resistance it will encounter as it's trying to flow through. So the graph on this slide is going to compare, or is comparing, viscosity of whole blood, is comparing it to plasma and also water. So basically, to understand the graph, the x-axis represents hematocrit, which is the percentage of red blood cells in the blood. And the y-axis represents viscosity. So we're talking about basically comparing the thickness of that blood to water, which has a viscosity of 1. All right, so the three lines show the whole blood cell viscosity, which is our red line. All right, it increases as the hematocrit rises. All right, in terms of plasma viscosity, which is the solid black line, the plasma alone is thicker than water, but it's much less than the whole blood. And then the water, which is the thin black line on the bottom, the double line, it acts as the baseline for the comparison. So how does hematocrit affect our viscosity? So at normal levels, so we're talking about around 40 to 45% hematocrit, the blood viscosity is about 3 to 4 times that of water. So when our hematocrit increases beyond the normal range, the blood becomes much thicker, and as the blood becomes thicker, we have an increase in the resistance of the flow. So a higher viscosity means that our heart has to work harder in order to push that blood through the vessels, which increases the blood pressure. So some conditions that can affect blood viscosity are high hematocrit. So we're talking about polycythemia, which increases viscosity, making blood harder to pump. You can experience this when you're dehydrated, if you're in a high altitude and your body's trying to adapt, or also disorders like polycythemia vera. In terms of having a low hematocrit, such as anemia, that decreases the viscosity, making blood thinner than normal. So this can reduce that oxygen delivery to our tissues, but it also reduces the resistance. And last but not least, another condition that causes our blood to thicken is dehydration. It thickens the blood because there's less plasma relative to our red blood cells, thus the blood viscosity is increased. So some examples of when this could happen: athletes that train in high altitudes, they do develop more red blood cells, and that increases the hematocrit and it actually improves the oxygen delivery for them, but it also slightly increases their blood viscosity. So another condition is people that have sickle cell disease. All right, they have thicker blood, and for them it increases their risk of blood clots. Blood thinners like aspirins help reduce clot formation by slightly lowering the viscosity. So blood viscosity is directly influenced by those hematocrit levels, and that affects how the blood flows, talking about resistance wise, how the heart is working or the workload that's placed on the heart. If the blood is more viscous, the heart is having to work harder to push the blood through, and also blood pressure is also affected. All right, now we're looking at how the diameter of our blood vessel can affect the blood flow and also the resistance. So we do know already that our blood vessels can expand. That term is called vasodilation, and they can also narrow, which is vasoconstriction. And that's going to influence how easily blood is going to be able to move through those vessels. So this image is basically trying to illustrate the effects of smooth muscle relaxation and also contraction in our vessel wall. So in section A, which is on the left side of our screen, it represents the different states of a blood vessel. So the first image is showing us vasodilation. All right, in vasodilation, that means that the vessel is wide, allowing blood to flow easily, and there's less resistance there. All right, picture number 2 is showing us what normal tone is. So this is basically the resting diameter of a blood vessel with moderate resistance. And picture number 3 is showing us vasoconstriction. So this is the vessel being narrowed, making it harder for blood to pass, and thus increasing the resistance. So as far as smooth muscle control is concerned, the smooth muscle in our blood vessel walls controls how much those vessels constrict or relax. So vasodilation typically occurs when the muscles relax, and vasoconstriction typically happens when they tighten. Now, on the right side of the screen, this section is basically showing us how the vessel diameter is going to affect blood pressure and also blood flow. All right, so diameter versus the blood flow. And then on this side, we have the pressure that's exiting. So there's 3 different vessels here. We have vasodilation at the top. Then we have normal muscle tone in the middle again, and then vasoconstriction at the bottom. So vasodilation is when the vessel is the widest. So blood is flowing the fastest, and right here it's saying 256 milliliters per minute. In terms of normal muscle tone, blood is flowing at 16 milliliters per minute. And then in terms of vasoconstriction, which is when the vessel is the narrowest, blood is only flowing at 1 milliliter per minute. So that's the slowest rate. So again, when we exercise, our vessels are going to dilate like this here at the top. When our vessels dilate, they are able to increase that blood flow to our muscles. All right, when we're cold, the vessels are going to constrict. All right, that's here. We're looking at the bottom. All right, and it's constricting to preserve that heat. So in conditions like hypertension, where we have persistent vasoconstriction, as in this one as well, that is going to increase that person's blood pressure. So typically what can happen is that person can be given medications like vasodilators, and those will help widen the vessels to help reduce that blood pressure. So the takeaway here is that blood vessel diameter is critical when it comes to regulating blood pressure and also circulation. The body constantly adjusts the vessel size to meet our body's needs, whether we're resting or whether we're exercising or whether it's some sort of response to our environment. So too much vasodilation can lead to, too much vasoconstriction can lead to high blood pressure, while excessive vasodilation can cause low blood pressure. Now let's discuss how resistance in the blood vessels are going to affect blood pressure. So peripheral resistance, basically we're talking about the opposition to the blood flow caused by friction between the blood and our vessel wall. So changes in resistance are going to impact our blood pressure either by increasing it or decreasing it. So The relationship between resistance and blood pressure, in terms of arterial blood pressure, it increases when the resistance increases and it decreases when the resistance decreases. So again, let's go back to that analogy of the garden hose. If you squeeze the nozzle, the pressure, the water pressure is going to increase because there's more resistance. All right, so causes of friction when we're talking about blood flow, they are influenced by two factors, and that's blood viscosity and also the diameters of our arterioles and also the capillaries. Blood viscosity, we're talking about how thick or viscous the blood is. The thicker the blood is, that means the higher the viscosity. That means it's moving slower, and that increases the resistance within the vessel. In terms of the diameter of the arterioles and capillaries, narrower vessels are going to cause more friction, and that's going to make it harder for that blood to flow through. So basically, the role of the arterioles in regulating resistance is when arterioles are small. Well, we already know arterioles are small blood vessels, and they do play a role in adjusting the resistance. So arterioles have a muscular layer, and it allows them to contract and also relax. So vasoconstriction is when they're contracting, and vasodilation is when they're relaxing. So in states when vasoconstriction is happening, we have a smaller diameter in our blood vessel, and therefore we're going to have more resistance. As a result, the person's blood pressure will be higher. In terms of states of vasodilation, that means now the vessel has a larger diameter, which means that there's less resistance of that blood flowing through, and that person, as a result, will have a lower blood pressure. So in conditions like hypertension, which is high blood pressure, those arterioles, they may remain constricted, increasing that resistance, thus increasing the person's blood pressure. So again, that person may have to take medications like vasodilators in order to help lower the blood pressure by widening the vessels. Also, conditions like exercise. So when we exercise, the arterioles supplying the muscles, they need to dilate in order to increase that blood flow. So in that instance, the dilation is going to widen the blood vessels, and the resistance is going to be less. All right, so blood pressure is directly linked to how much resistance our blood faces as it's trying to move through the vessels of our body. So the body constantly, again, is adjusting that resistance to ensure that proper blood flow and oxygen delivery are going to be possible. So small changes in the arterial diameter have a major effect on the person's blood pressure. In this slide, we're taking a look at how blood vessel diameter controlled by vasomotor effects is going to influence a person's blood pressure. So vasomotion, basically we're talking about the contraction and the relaxation of those blood vessels, mainly in the arterioles, which regulate resistance and pressure. So blood pressure, the blood pressure gradient across the circulatory system is basically, we already know that it is highest in the arteries, and it gradually decreases as the blood moves through arterioles, capillaries, and also veins. So this graph basically shows how vasoconstriction, or those narrowing, and also vasodilation, or the widening of those vessels, is going to affect blood pressure. So basically, this graph has three curves on it, and it represents different conditions of arterial diameter. All right, so we have the green line, which represents arteriolar constriction. Then the black line shows us normal, and then the purple line shows us arteriolar dilation. All right, so in terms of arteriolar constriction, when the arterioles narrow, the blood pressure increases. All right, so again, we're looking at pressure on the y-axis, and we're looking at the actual vessels down here. So, and of course the colors represent arteries. small arteries, capillaries, and also veins. So the next curve, which is the middle curve or the black curve, we're looking at, this is a typical blood pressure. So basically, typical blood pressure is going to drop as that blood moves from arteries to veins. So as you can see, we have the larger arteries here, and then the blood pressure is dropping as we're going from the next smallest, the small arteries to the arterioles to the capillaries, and then to the veins. And then the last line that we're going to look at is the purple line. That's arteriolar dilation, the lowest curve. So when the arterioles widen, all right, the resistance decreases. All right, when the resistance decreases, the blood pressure drops quickly. So as you can see here, that is that line right there, the purple line, as the blood vessels are widening. All right, and as you can see, the blood pressure is dropping. So the importance of the arterioles in terms of blood pressure regulation is they're often called the resistance vessels because they are basically the primary site for that blood pressure control. So small changes in the arterial diameter are going to have a big impact on the blood flow and also the overall pressure in the patient. Now let's talk about vasomotor control mechanism. All right, that is basically the regulation of those blood vessels diameter-wise, and that's basically to maintain that stable blood pressure and also the blood flow distribution throughout the body. So the vasomotor system works through signaling the nervous system to either widen or dilate your vessels or narrow, meaning constrict those vessels. We're talking about arterioles, and it's typically based on the demands of the body. So the arterioles, which are the small arteries, they have muscles in their walls that can contract and also relax to adjust their diameter. So this helps maintain that steady blood pressure and also direct blood flow to tissues that need it the most, like our muscles during exercise or our brain when we're doing cognitive tasks. So our vasomotor pressure reflexes, basically blood pressure reflexes, basically they're a built-in system or a built-in reflex that responds to changes to the blood pressure. So the reflexes involve those baroreceptors that we were talking about earlier, and they're basically pressure sensitive sensors that are located in the aorta and also in the carotid artery. So when blood pressure increases, the baroreceptors detect that rise in pressure and they signal the vasodilation of those arterioles and also the venules. This allows more blood to flow into reservoirs and it reduces pressure in the arteries, preventing hypertension or high blood pressure. When the blood pressure decreases, the body of course senses that as well, and that drop triggers vasoconstriction or tells the body that we need to narrow our blood vessels, and this in turn is going to raise the blood pressure by increasing resistance, helping ensure that enough blood is reaching those vital organs like our heart and also our brain. So if you've ever suddenly stood up too fast and your blood pressure dropped and you felt dizzy, that is our vasomotor control mechanism at work. So your body quickly constricts those arterioles to raise the blood pressure and keep you from fainting. On the other hand, if you've ever overheated, your blood vessels would have dilated to try and help keep your body cool by increasing the blood flow. So again, the vasomotor control system is a mechanism that helps us maintain that state of homeostasis, and it ensures that our blood pressure is going to remain stable and that the blood is directed to areas that need it most. If there's any sort of dysfunction or a malfunction of this system, it can contribute to conditions like hypertension, fainting, and also circulation issues like shock. All right, on this slide, we're looking at relative blood volume. So basically, we're looking at how the blood is distributed throughout our circulatory system. So the percentage values represent the proportion of total blood volume that's found in these different parts of the body at any given time. So basically, it's important for us to understand this blood distribution as because it affects not only circulation but also blood pressure and how the body's able to respond to different conditions. So in terms of blood volume distribution, most of the blood in the body is found in those systemic veins and also the venules that we see right here, about 66% of it. So they act basically as a reservoir for the blood. All right, and then we have about 12% in the pulmonary loop. All right, in pulmonary circulation. All right, so that's the blood is basically traveling between the heart and the lungs for oxygenation. All right, and only 6% of the blood is in the heart at any given time, and then we have about 11% in the systemic arteries and arterioles. And these vessels are responsible for distributing oxygenated blood to our tissues. All right, for our systemic capillaries, they hold only about 5% of our blood volume, and they're basically the sites at which the nutrients and the gas exchange happens. So why the systemic veins hold the most blood is because they are capacitance vessels. All right, they have very thin, flexible walls, and it allows them to expand in order to store large amounts of blood. If the body needs more blood in circulation, then the veins can constrict to push more blood towards the heart and process it through that process called venous return. All right, so this reserve of blood helps regulate our blood pressure and also that cardiac output. So the reason why arteries hold the least amount of blood is because arteries have thicker muscular walls and they maintain that high pressure to push the blood through the body. So because those arteries are under such high pressure, they don't store large amounts of blood like the veins do. Instead, they focus more on distributing that blood quickly and efficiently to our tissues. So during exercise, the veins constrict to push more blood towards the heart and muscles. And if a person, let's say, loses blood due to injury, the veins reduce their capacity to maintain circulation and prevent that drop in blood pressure. So understanding relative blood volume is basically going to help you be able to explain why veins are important blood reservoirs and why arteries need to maintain that high pressure for blood distribution. So again, we need a proper balance to ensure that blood is circulating properly, oxygen and nutrients are being delivered, and the overall cardiovascular system is functioning. This slide is basically trying to illustrate how blood flow is distributed to our different organs at rest, during light exercise, during strenuous exercise, and also during max exercise. So the bars represent the total cardiac output in liters per minute at each level of activity. So as exercise intensity increases, we're looking at the way blood is distributed throughout the body and how it changes dramatically to meet the body's demands. So let's look at number 1, which is the body at rest. All right, we have there about 5.8 liters per minute. So at rest, the blood flow is fairly evenly distributed among the organs. The GI tract, the kidneys, and also the skeletal muscles, they receive a significant portion of blood flow at rest. And also the skeletal muscles receive only about 1.2 liters per minute since there's not an increased demand for it. Now we go up to light exercise, which is number 2. So as the body begins to move, the skeletal muscle blood flow increases. It increases to 4.5 liters per minute. Blood flow to the brain, the heart, and also the skin, they remain relatively stable. And then you see that the kidney and GI blood flow, they decrease slightly as the muscles at this point are being prioritized. All right, now we're going to move to strenuous exercise, which is 17.5 liters per minute. All right, so the skeletal muscle blood flow jumps significantly. It jumps to 12.5 liters per minute as that oxygen and nutrients are needed to sustain movement. Blood flow to the heart also increases to 1.9 liters per minute, ensuring that it can pump harder and also faster. And then we see that the skin blood flow rises slightly to help regulate our body temperature, and blood flow to the digestive organs and kidneys, they continue to decrease. All right, last but not least, let's look at number 4. So we're talking about a person at maximal exercise level. So they're working out really hard, very strenuous exercise there. And we're up to 25 liters per minute. So at peak exertion, most of the blood, so we're talking about 22 liters per minute, is directed to our skeletal muscles. So the shift basically is going to ensure that the muscles are receiving the oxygen and the nutrients it needs to sustain that high intensity movement. Blood flow to the skin, heart, and brain, they're going to remain roughly stable. And then blood flow to the digestive organs and kidneys is at its lowest point, as they're not a priority while we're exercising at this intense rate. So again, the shift in blood flow is why people feel a reduced appetite during exercise. That is because digestion slows down because the blood is prioritized elsewhere. If exercise is too intense or too prolonged, the reduced kidney function and also the digestive processes can cause dehydration and also sometimes stomach discomfort in a person. So last but not least, the increase in the skin blood flow helps with the cooling, which is why sweating increases during exercise. So again, this chart is basically highlighting the body's ability to redirect that blood flow based on our physical demand. So during exercise, that circulatory system is prioritizing the skeletal muscles, the heart, and also the skin, and then it reduces the blood flow to the non-essential organs like the digestive system. So basically, we're redistributing the blood flow where it is needed. We already discussed this earlier, but this is just another visual attempting to explain the role of the vasomotor pressor reflexes in controlling the blood pressure by adjusting the diameter of our blood vessels. So those pressor reflexes, again, we call those baroreflexes. They're going to help regulate the blood pressure by detecting changes in the vessel stretch and also triggering the nervous system response. So the baroreceptors are responsible for the pressure sensitive they're basically pressure sensitive receptors, and they're located in the carotid sinus and also the aortic arch, which we learned earlier. Their job is to detect the changes in the blood pressure and send signals to the cardiac control center and also the vasomotor center in the medulla of the brain. These receptors communicate through 2 of our cranial nerves. That's the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is cranial nerve number 9 from the carotid sinus, and also the vagus nerve, which is cranial nerve 10 from the aortic arch. So basically, their response to increased blood pressure, when the blood pressure rises, the baroreceptors increase their signaling to the medulla. That parasympathetic nervous system via that vagus nerve is going to be activated, and it's going to slow the heart rate, causing vasodilation. So basically, we're widening the blood vessels at that moment, and this is going to reduce the blood pressure by decreasing that resistance in the blood vessels. Their response to decreased blood pressure is when the blood pressure drops, the baroreceptors are going to send fewer signals to the medulla. The sympathetic nervous system is going to activate, and that is going to lead to increased heart rate, in which the cardiac nerve will stimulate that. And then we have vasoconstriction happening, meaning the blood vessels are going to be narrowed via the sympathetic nerve fibers. So these actions are going to help raise the person's blood pressure back to normal, hopefully. So again, this system ensures that our blood pressure remains stable during changes in our posture, whether we're at rest or whether we're exercising. Also, let's say an example we gave early, when we stand up quickly, these reflexes prevent dizziness by tightening the vessels and increasing the heart rate. Patients with conditions like orthostatic hypertension, they experience problems with this reflex that leads to dizziness or fainting. And orthostatic hypertension, basically, if I'm laying down and I get up too quickly, I might feel dizzy. All right, so again, the vasomotor pressor reflexes are basically ensuring that we maintain that stable blood pressure by adjusting that vessel diameter and heart activity in response to those pressure changes. So again, this is that feedback system that we talked about earlier that protects the body from those sudden drops or sudden spikes in blood pressure. All right, now we're focusing on how the body controls blood vessel diameter using those chemoreflexes and also the medullary ischemic reflex to help regulate that blood pressure and also circulation. So those vasomotor chemoreflexes basically involve chemoreceptors found in the aortic and the carotid bodies, and those receptors basically monitor changes in the blood chemistry. Specifically, they can detect hypercapnia, which is high carbon dioxide, hypoxia, which is low oxygen levels, and also decreased blood pH, which means that the blood has become too acidic. So when these conditions occur, these chemoreceptors are going to send signals to the brainstem in order to adjust the blood pressure and also the respiratory rate. So this will help restore the proper oxygen delivery and also carbon dioxide removal. So the medullary ischemic reflex, that's an emergency response. All right, and it activates when our blood flow to the medulla oblongata drops too low. So when the brain senses this reduced blood supply, it triggers the arterial and also venous constriction, which increases the blood pressure to help restore circulation. So this reflex is basically critical during times when maybe a person has severe blood loss or maybe they have gone into shock. So both of these mechanisms are going to help the body respond to low oxygen conditions, such as maybe the person is at high levels of exercise, intense exercise. It'll help respond to high altitude exposure, and then also medical conditions like respiratory failure. So the medullary ischemic reflex is, again, a critical reflex that we have that basically puts our body into survival mode in order to maintain that blood flow to the brain. So again, that vasomotor control mechanism is going to ensure that the body maintains a stable blood pressure and also oxygen delivery. So, and the chemoreflexes are going to monitor our blood chemistry, while the medullary ischemic reflex is going to act as that emergency response to low blood supply to the brain. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit about how the higher brain centers, specifically the cerebral cortex and also the hypothalamus, play a role in helping control blood vessel constriction and dilation as well. So these higher brain centers, they send signals to the vasomotor centers in the medulla, and though they are going to signal it to regulate vasoconstriction and vasodilation as well. So vasoconstriction, we're talking about narrowing the blood vessels, and vasodilation, we're talking about widening the blood vessels. So the role of these higher brain centers, specifically the cerebral cortex, it's responsible for processing things such as emotions, stress responses, and also maybe our thoughts. And the hypothalamus helps regulate the autonomic nervous system. So that includes things such as our heart rate, our blood pressure, and also our body temperature. So how these brains control the blood vessels is when the body is under stress, like fear, anxiety, etc., the brain signals the vasomotor center in the medulla to constrict those blood vessels and increase our blood pressure. During stages of relaxation, the brain sends signals that cause the blood vessels to dilate and reduce that blood pressure. So this explains a little bit why our emotions like stress and anxiety can affect our heart rate and also circulation. So again, if you've ever noticed that when you're scared, how your heart beats faster, or how your skin might feel cold, this basically happens because the brain is telling your body to redirect that blood flow to the essential organs like the heart and also the muscles. This slide is just a visual on how those chemoreflexes help regulate the blood pressure and the circulation in response to changes in the blood chemistry. So again, those chemoreceptors located in the carotid and the aortic bodies, they're going to detect changes in oxygen and also changes in carbon dioxide and blood pH levels. All right, when these levels become abnormal, the vasomotor center in the brainstem is going to adjust the blood vessel activity in order to restore that balance. So, in terms of the peripheral chemoreceptors and their role, those carotid bodies and the aortic bodies contain those chemoreceptors that monitor that blood composition. So again, if oxygen levels drop and CO2 levels rise, so we're talking about hypercapnia, or the blood becomes more acidic, what happens is they send a signal to that vasomotor center in the medulla oblongata, and they are going to adjust the circulation. In terms of the vasomotor center response, if the oxygen is low or CO2 levels are too high, the medulla is going to reduce the parasympathetic impulses. All right, that's shown by that blue arrow, which normally slows the heart rate. At the same time, it's going to increase the sympathetic impulses, shown by the orange arrows or the red arrows, and that's going to stimulate vasoconstriction. So basically narrowing those blood vessels to increase the blood pressure and restore the oxygen supply. The impact that that has on the blood vessels in the heart is the vagus nerve, which is the green arrow, is now going to play a role in that parasympathetic control, but in response to the low oxygen, its activity is going to decrease. The sympathetic fibers will cause the smooth muscles in the blood vessel walls to constrict, raising the blood pressure and improving that patient circulation. So this process is going to help get more oxygen rich blood to those organs that need it, including the brain and also the heart. Now we're looking at a concept called local control of blood flow by arterioles. So we learned that the arterioles are those small blood vessels that control how much blood reaches those different tissues. Again, they can dilate or expand, or they can constrict and narrow based on local needs rather than signals from the brain or signals from the nervous system. So local dilation and also blood flow can happen in certain conditions in tissue that causes vasodilation or widening of the arterioles to increase the blood flow to that area. All right, that process is called reactive hyperemia, which means we have a temporary increase in the blood supply after a period of time of reduced flow. So it ensures that the tissues are getting the oxygen and nutrients they need after being deprived. So some examples of this reactive hyperemia is if you've ever placed a rubber band around your wrist, and your hand begins to turn, your hand, you've restricted it for a little while. After you take it off or remove the rubber band, your hand starts to turn red. All right, another example of when your skin becomes warm and flush after exercise due to increased blood flow to those active muscles if that blood supply is cut off again for a short time, like when we cross our legs for too long. That area might look a little pale at first, but then it turns red as the blood is rushing back in. So this is an example of local control. And the reason why reactive hyperemia is important, it's a protective mechanism. It's going to help prevent tissue damage from that lack of oxygen. So it plays a role in healing and also inflammation in terms of damage or inflamed tissue, by releasing chemicals and triggering local vasodilation to bring in more blood and also immune cells. So again, it's a mechanism that's essential not only for things such as wound healing, but also exercise recovery and also thermoregulation, or keeping our body temperature stable. Now let's talk a little bit about venous return. So venous return is basically the amount of blood that flows back to the heart through the veins. So venous return, we know it's essential because it determines how much blood the heart has available in order to pump out to the body with each heartbeat. So venous return, again, unlike arteries, which have that high pressure, veins rely on those muscle contractions, also breathing movements, and those one-way valves in order to push the blood back to the heart. So there is an effect called the stress relaxation effect. And this effect basically describes how the veins can stretch and adjust their diameter in response to blood pressure changes. So when our blood pressure rises, the veins stretch, meaning they dilate, and they're going to do that in order to accommodate more blood, all right, helping maintain that steady flow of blood. When pressure drops, our veins contract slightly to keep that blood moving. So this is an automatic process. So it happens within certain limits. So if veins stretch too much, of course, blood can pool, and that can lead to circulation problems. Now, the role, let's talk a little bit about the role of gravity. So I want to talk about the orthostatic effect. So gravity can make venous return more difficult, especially when we stand for long periods or when we sit for long periods. Blood tends to pool in our lower body, which can cause a temporary drop in blood pressure when standing up too quickly. That's called the orthostatic effect. And some people also experience dizziness or lightheadedness when they stand up too suddenly, due to a decrease in the venous return. So this is why things such as compression socks are used to prevent that blood from pooling in our legs, especially for people who stand or sit for long hours. It's also why moving our legs and also flexing our calf muscles while sitting for long periods, such as on an airplane, is going to help prevent conditions like deep vein thrombosis. Athletes and also other individuals with low blood pressure, they often do light movements before standing up quickly, and that helps prevent them from becoming dizzy when they stand up. So again, venous return is a key factor when it comes to circulation. It ensures that the heart is getting enough blood to pump efficiently, and factors like vein elasticity, muscle movement, and also gravity influence how effective that blood return is going to be back to the heart. Now we're going to look a little bit at how gravity affects blood distribution. So gravity does actually affect blood distribution in our body, and it's based on our position, whether we're reclining or whether we're standing upright. So we need to understand how gravity influences circulation in order to help explain issues like dizziness when standing up too fast to our patients. So um, in in picture A, we have a person in the reclining position. Basically, when they're laying down, the blood is evenly distributed throughout the body. There's minimal gravitational pull that's affecting the circulation at that point. So the heart doesn't have to work as hard to pump the blood to the brain because the head, the heart, and the lower body are all at the same level. All right, in picture number 2, the person is standing, or picture B, the person is standing upright. All right, when we're standing, gravity is actually pulling the blood downward towards our lower body. So the heart has to work a little harder to push the blood back up to the brain. So pressure gradients are going to change, and when the pressure gradients change, the blood tends to pool in the lower extremities, especially in the one where the person is standing. So we're talking about it's pooling in like the areas of our legs and also our feet, which it can reduce the venous return to the heart. So this can cause things such as, or lead to things such as orthostatic hypertension. So again, in picture A, if that person were to stand up quickly, we can have a temporary drop in the blood pressure, and it can cause that person to become dizzy. So basically, how the body compensates for these changes in the pressure, or quick changes in pressure, is to prevent the blood from pooling in the legs. The body uses baroreceptors. Those are those pressure sensors we talked about earlier, and those again are in the arteries to trigger that vasoconstriction, so narrowing of the blood vessels. So things such as muscle contraction in our legs, they also are going to help push that blood back to the heart. So this is why standing still for long periods of time without movement can also lead to fainting. So muscles aren't helping with keeping our blood circulating. So again, another thing, when we're talking about real world application, this is why astronauts experience changes in circulation when they return to Earth from space. So without gravity, their bodies don't have to work against the pressure gradients, and that leads to basically a temporary decrease in their cardiovascular efficiency. It's also why people feel lightheaded when they get up too quickly from the bed or from that laying position in the morning. Again, their body hasn't adjusted or had time to adjust to that shift in that blood distribution. So again, gravity does play a major role in blood circulation. When we stand, the body has to actively adjust in order to maintain that blood flow to the brain. All right, now we're moving on to some additional learning objectives. So again, these are related to blood flow, volume, and velocity, and also identifying pulse. So these learning objectives are: identify and discuss the most important factors influencing venous returns to the heart, discuss measurement of the arterial blood pressure, explain how the blood pressure gradient and peripheral resistance are related to the minute volume in blood, describe how the velocity of blood flow is governed, define pulse and identify the factors most responsible for its existence, and identify the body areas where the pulse can be felt and the areas where pressure may be applied to stop arterial bleeding, and then discuss the types of circulatory shock, hypertension, and also hypotension. All right, now we're going to be discussing venous pumps. So these are the mechanisms that are going to help return blood to the heart. So since veins work against gravity, especially in our lower body, like our lower limbs and our feet, they rely on other systems to help push that blood back to the heart. So venous pump refers to a mechanism that assists with moving that blood through the veins, particularly from the legs and the lower body back to the heart. So veins have a one-way valve to prevent the blood from flowing backwards, but they also need additional help to help maintain our circulation. So breathing is going to play a role in venous return. So during inspiration, when we breathe in, the pressure in the chest cavity is going to decrease,
while the pressure in the abdominal cavity is going to increase. And this creates a pressure gradient that helps pull blood from those peripheral veins in the body into the vena cava, which is again that central vein that leads to the heart. And this process also helps ensure the steady return of blood to the heart even when we're resting. When we walk, when we move, when our muscles contract, they're also squeezing veins or nearby veins and pushing blood toward the heart as well. So this process is often called muscle pump or milking action of the veins. So every time a muscle contracts, it compresses the veins, forcing blood to move upward through the valve. So this is why people who sit or stand for long periods of time without movement are at risk for poor circulation and swelling in their legs. This is also why your doctor may recommend walking around during long flights where you're sitting still for very long. That is because it will slow down that venous return and increase your risk for conditions like blood clots. All right, so again, venous pump is basically helps with the circulation return in the lower body. So breathing and muscle contractions work together as well, in addition to exercise movements. Now this illustration is trying to show us how breathing, known as respiration, helps with that venous return. And venous return, we already stated that it was that process of moving the blood back to the heart. So these two diagrams basically compare a person breathing out versus a person breathing in. So on the left we have expiration, breathing out, and on the right we have inspiration, which is breathing in. We're looking at the effects that they have on that venous blood flow. So on the left side, again, we're looking at expiration. So when we exhale or breathe out, the pressure in our thoracic cavity, so we're talking about the chest cavity, increases. And this pressure, this compresses the veins in the chest, so slightly slowing the blood return to the heart. All right, those veins in the abdomen are going to experience less pressure, allowing that blood to pool momentarily. On the right side, we see inspiration. So we're taking a deep breath in, or we're inhaling. At that point, the pressure in the thoracic cavity is going to decrease, while the abdominal pressure is going to increase. All right, and this is going to pull that venous blood upward towards the heart. So again, this mechanism is going to aid in that venous return by creating a pressure gradient that encourages the blood flow to move from the lower portion of our body back to the heart. All right, along with the respiratory pump that we just talked about, we also have the muscle pump. All right, and this is another mechanism that is going to help with that venous return. So again, unlike the arteries, the veins have to rely on some external forces to help push the blood back to the heart. So again, one of these key forces is going to be your skeletal muscle contraction. So this process is really important, especially in our lower extremities, where the blood has to travel basically against gravity. It's traveling from our lower limbs, like our feet, back up towards our heart. So when the muscles are relaxed, in the first picture, you can see that the blood somewhat pools in the veins of our legs. All right, gravity can slow down that movement of that venous blood flow back to the heart. The venous valves do help prevent the backflow, but without the muscle contractions, the flow would remain kind of slow or sluggish. All right, so the contracted muscle that we see on the right, when that skeletal muscle contracts, it basically squeezes the surrounding veins, and this compression is going to force that blood upward. All right, so as you can see in this first image, the blood was kind of pulled here, and as we flex our muscle, now the blood is starting to move upward. All right, so the again, this compression force the blood upwards towards the heart, and the venous valves are going to prevent that blood from moving backwards or preventing it from backflowing. Again, these rhythmic contractions and relaxations of our muscles, again, are creating pumping effects that help improve circulation. All right, so we looked at how the venous return is assisted by respiratory pump and also venal pump, um, respiratory pump and also muscle pump. So now we're going to look at the venous valves, or the valves that are in our veins. All right, they're basically responsible for preventing that backflow of blood and ensuring that we get that proper venous return of blood to the heart. So again, the veins, they have low pressure, so they don't have that high pressure like the arteries have. So that means that they needed additional mechanisms like these valves and those muscle contractions to help assist with that blood flow. So in figure A, this is when we have the muscles relaxed, the blood can pool in the veins, and that's due to the gravity above it. I mean the gravity. So the pressure basically is higher below the valve and lower above it. So this is going to allow that blood to flow upward towards the heart, but without contraction movement. All right, and it is slow. All right, so when we contract the muscles on image on the right, those muscles contract and they compress the veins. All right, that contracting of the veins is what creates that high pressure environment. All right, and the blood is going to move from a high pressure to, of course, low pressure. So the force, this is going to force the blood upward towards the heart. Now, at the same time, those venous valves are going to close in order to prevent the backflow of that blood, and that's going to ensure that it's flowing in that one direction, which is back up towards the heart. So again, those venous valves are going to prevent or help prevent, hopefully, conditions like varicose veins, where if the valve did malfunction, it would lead to that blood pooling, and the blood would, that vein would, of course, enlarge. All right, so this is basically just showing you not only the muscle pumping action, but also how the valves assist in ensuring that the blood flow is going back up towards the heart. All right, now we're going to look at a concept of total blood volume and how it influences circulation and also fluid exchange between capillaries and interstitial fluid. So basically understanding how the blood volume changes affects the venous return and the tissue perfusion is going to be essential for us in a clinical setting, especially in conditions like dehydration and also heart failure in a patient. So some of the key points that this slide covers is the first point is the changes in total blood volume. So the total amount of blood in our circulatory system directly impacts how much blood is returned to the heart. So a decrease in our blood volume, let's say hypovolemia, can lead to low blood pressure and reduced tissue perfusion. In addition, an increase in blood volume, hypervolemia, can raise the blood pressure and also increase the cardiac workload or put stress on the heart. So, fluid movement at the capillary level is important. All right, the arterial end, so we're talking about hydrostatic pressure dominates. So at the arterial end of the capillary, hydrostatic pressure is the primary driving force. So the pressure experienced there pushes fluid out of the plasma and into our surrounding interstitial fluid, and this is important for delivering that oxygen and nutrients to our tissues. All right, in terms of the venous end, we're talking about osmotic pressure dominates. So at the venous end of the capillary, osmotic pressure is the strongest force. So it's going to pull that fluid back into the plasma from the interstitial fluid, and about, I'll say, 90% of the fluid lost at the arterial end is recovered, ensuring that we have a balance in circulation. So clinically, imbalances in this exchange would lead to things such as edema, which is we have excess fluid in the tissues. And if that fluid is not properly reabsorbed, of course, this edema is going to remain. Also, conditions like malnutrition, where we have low plasma proteins, congestive heart failure, and also kidney disease can disrupt this fluid exchange process. So IV fluids and diuretics can be used, especially in hospitals, to kind of regulate this blood volume and also pressure. So blood volume is going to be that key regulator when it comes to circulation. All right, and it's going to influence everything from our blood pressure to that capillary exchange. All right, in the previous slide, we talked about how most of the fluid that was lost at the arterial end of the capillary is going to be recovered at the venous end. One thing to note is that not all of the fluid is going to be reabsorbed by the capillaries. There's approximately about 10% of that fluid that's going to remain in those interstitial spaces. So this slide basically focuses on the lymphatic system, which we will discuss next week as well. And it plays a role in recovering some of that excess fluid and also returning it to the circulatory system. So the lymphatic system is basically a network of vessels and nodes, and they also help regulate fluid imbalance, fluid balance rather. They also help with the immune response and also fat absorption. So we have lymphatic capillaries, and they're present throughout our tissues, and they act kind of like a drainage pathway for excess interstitial fluid. All right, and if they can do that, of course, they would prevent conditions like edema. So the excess fluid, once it's absorbed by the lymphatic system, it turns into something called lymph. All right, so the process of fluid recovery in terms of the lymphatic capillaries, they're going to absorb that remaining interstitial fluid along with things such as proteins and cellular debris and immune cells. The fluid is then going to be transported through some larger lymphatic vessels. They get progressively larger, and there's going to be filtered through our lymph nodes, and eventually it will be returned to that venous system. So this again is going to prevent fluid accumulation in our tissues, and it's also going to assist with ensuring we have proper circulation. So lymphatic return to the venous blood, basically the lymphatic fluid is going to re-enter circulation at our subclavian vein. So we're talking about up near the heart. And this is going to be essential again for maintaining blood volume and also preventing tissue swelling. Without this lymphatic system, that circulatory system would lose a significant amount of plasma, and that could lead to severe drops in our blood pressure as well. And in addition to that, it could lead to edema. So disruptions in our lymphatic function can lead to things like lymphedema, where we have excess fluid accumulating in our tissues. If you notice in a person that has lymphedema, it will cause swelling. All right, now we're focusing on Starling's law of capillaries, which is basically trying to describe to us the movement of the fluid across the capillary wall. So the process is definitely essential in order to maintain fluid balance between the bloodstream and also the surrounding tissues. So fluid movement is basically driven by what we call hydrostatic pressure, which is the blood pressure, and also osmotic pressure, which is the proteins in our blood. All right, so fluid movement at the arterial end of the capillary is where the hydrostatic pressure or blood pressure is stronger. All right, and for that reason, the inward, basically we have an inward force of osmosis happening there. So the pressure difference causes the fluid to be pushed out of the capillary into the surrounding interstitial fluid, or extracellular space. All right, nutrients and oxygen are delivered at that point to the tissues through this particular process. All right, on the venous end, as the blood moves towards the venous end of the capillary, the hydrostatic pressure drops. All right, now the osmotic pressure created by the plasma proteins like albumin is stronger than the hydrostatic pressure, and this is going to pull that fluid back into the capillary from the interstitial space, carrying now waste products and CO2 for removal, because when it was in the tissue initially, that's where the again, the capillaries allow that nutrients and gas exchange. So again, the role of the lymphatic system is, because not all of the fluid that leaves at the arterial end returns at the venous end. Again, approximately 90% of that fluid is going to be reabsorbed by the blood, while 10% is going to enter that lymphatic system, and those lymphatic vessels are going to eventually return that fluid to the venous circulation to prevent that fluid accumulation, which would lead to edema. All right, clinical relevance here, edema or swelling is a result of that fluid imbalance. All right, it's disrupted, and it leads to excess fluid in the tissues. All right, and that is possible with patients that are going into heart failure. Maybe they have a blocked lymph system, or also they have low blood protein levels. So again, Starling's law of the capillaries is basically vital for tissue hydration and also waste removal. The balance between hydrostatic pressure and osmotic pressure is going to ensure that those nutrients reach the cells, and also that that excess fluid is going to be removed. This slide is focusing on mechanisms that regulate our total blood volume. All right, and this is critical for that circulatory stability and also tissue perfusion. So basically we're talking about the body's ability to maintain that adequate blood volume, and it depends on fluid balance between the plasma, also interstitial fluid, and also intercellular compartments. So some key points here: mechanisms that change our blood volume quickly. The most rapid changes in our blood volume are going to occur due to shifts in water movement into and out of our bloodstream. For example, dehydration can cause our plasma to lose volume, leading to low blood pressure, which would be hypotension. In addition, fluid overload can cause or increase the plasma volume and lead to high blood pressure or hypertension, and also edema. So these shifts occur due to things such as filtration, osmosis, and also hormonal regulation. All right, in terms of the role of antidiuretic hormones, so one of the most important regulators of blood volume is ADH, also called vasopressin. So ADH is released from our posterior pituitary gland, and it's released in response to low blood volume and also increased blood osmolality. So low blood volume is detected by the baroreceptors in the heart and also the blood vessels. All right, increased blood osmolality is detected by osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus. So ADH basically is going to help conserve water by increasing water reabsorption in the kidneys, and also it's going to reduce urine output, and this is going to prevent further dehydration and also stabilize the blood pressure and also the blood volume. So how this can be clinically relevant in a diabetic person, especially in terms of diabetic insipidus is a condition where the body lacks that ADH, and it leads to the person having excessive urine output, which can lead to dehydration. In addition, syndromes of inappropriate secretion can also cause the body to retain too much water, and that would lead to conditions like hypernatremia, which is low sodium levels. All right, and a condition such as severe dehydration can also trigger things such as hypovolemic shock, which is a medical emergency where the blood volume is too low to sustain life. So again, our body is going to tightly regulate the blood volume, especially if everything is working up to par. It will tightly regulate the blood volume through hormonal and also neural mechanisms to prevent dehydration and also overhydration. And ADH is going to play a role in that fluid balance by reducing water loss through urine. All right, this slide is illustrating three major hormonal systems that are going to influence fluid retention and also fluid balance. All right, we have ADH, ANH, and also RAS over here. All right, so again, ADH is antidiuretic hormone. The RAS system is the aldosterone system, which is renin angiotensin aldosterone system, and then we have the atrial natriuretic hormone. All right, so the ADH is also known as vasopressin. So it's secreted by our neurohypophysis, which is our posterior pituitary gland, and it secretes those hormones when we have low blood volume detected by those vasoreceptors in the heart and the vessels. Also, it can excrete when we have conditions where we have high blood osmolality, and that's again detected by osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus. All right, ADH is basically going to reduce urine output. All right, and it does that by increasing the water reabsorption in the kidneys. All right, and that's going to help restore plasma volume and also prevent dehydration. All right, it also is going to cause vasoconstriction, and that's going to assist in helping maintain the blood pressure. All right, over here on the RAS side, the RAS system is activated in response to low blood pressure and also low sodium levels. So the renin is going to be released by the kidneys, and it's going to convert the angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1, which is further converted into angiotensin 2 by an enzyme, angiotensin converting enzyme called ACE. All right, angiotensin 2 is a powerful vasoconstrictor, so it's going to increase our blood pressure. It's also going to stimulate our adrenal cortex to release aldosterone, which is going to promote that sodium and water retention in the kidneys. So this mechanism is also going to help restore blood volume and also blood pressure. All right, the last mechanism that can influence our total plasma volume is the ANH. And ANH is produced by the cardiac atrial cells in response to high blood volume and also high blood pressure. ANH also is going to promote sodium and water excretion by the kidneys, which opposing the effects of the ADH and the aldosterone. So this hormone is going to help to lower the blood pressure by increasing that urine output and also reducing the plasma volume. So again, in terms of clinical prevalence, hypertension is often treated with ACE inhibitors. All right, and these are going to block that angiotensin 2 formation and reduce the vasoconstriction and lower the blood pressure. In terms of heart failure patients, they may have excessive ADH and aldosterone secretion, leading to fluid overload and also edema. All right, dehydration and also hemorrhage can trigger that RAS activation to restore that blood volume. So again, total plasma volume is tightly regulated by some of our hormonal mechanisms to maintain that level of homeostasis. All right, now we looked at ADH and we discussed renin and angiotensin. So now we're just going to take a look at the RAS system. So the RAS is basically a system that we have hormonal mechanism that's going to help regulate our blood pressure and also help with fluid balance. So the renin, again, it's released by the kidneys in response to low blood pressure, all right, low sodium levels, or they can have reduced blood flow. That renin is going to trigger a cascade effect that is going to lead to the production of angiotensin 2, which has two major effects on our body. One, it is going to assist with vasoconstriction, which is going to increase the blood pressure by narrowing the blood vessels. And two, that stimulating aldosterone secretion is going to promote sodium and water retention, which is also going to increase our blood volume. So again, these combined effects are going to help restore blood pressure and also circulation. Again, as far as clinical relevance, medications like ACE inhibitors and angiotensin receptor blockers, they're going to be commonly used to treat hypertension by blocking parts of this RAS system. All right, and this is the last hormone mechanism that we looked at or talked about. This is the atrial natriuretic hormone, ANH, and it is also a cardiac hormone that plays a role in fluid and blood pressure regulation. So ANH is released by the atria of the heart, and it's released in response to increased blood volume or high blood pressure. So its main functions include basically promoting diuresis, which is increased urine production, and this is going to help remove some of that excess water and sodium from the patient's body. And it also decreases blood volume, and it does that by increasing sodium loss in urine. So the ANH reduces fluid retention, which is going to lower our blood volume and reduce that venous return to the heart. So ANH acts the opposite to a renin or the RAS system. All right, it's going to be providing a balance in blood pressure regulation. All right, clinical prevalence as far as this mechanism is concerned, ANH levels may be elevated in conditions like heart failure, where the heart is struggling to manage increased blood volume. All right, now this slide is basically a graph that's illustrating the different arterial pressure regulation mechanisms that we talked about and their response times following a sudden change in pressure. So the response mechanisms are categorized into three types. We have fast acting responses, meaning they're going to respond in seconds to minutes. We have CNS ischemic responses, which are basically activated, if we're talking about, well, the three types are fast acting, intermediate responses, which is minutes to hours, and then of course we have some that respond, in the days, or could respond over the days. So basically, how much time is it taking for the response to happen? So in terms of the fast acting responses, the seconds to minutes, we have a CNS ischemic response. So basically, so we're looking at the letter A. All right, so this one is activated when we have severe hypotension. All right, so that is when the CNS response is going to kick in, or the central nervous system. All right, then we have those baroreceptors. All right, and that is highlighted by the um, the B line. So let me change this color. All right, the B line, which is here, which it's blue. All right, so our baroreceptors, again, they're located in the aortic arch and the carotid sinuses, and they're going to respond immediately to changes in blood pressure. All right, and then we have the chemoreceptors, which is represented by the line, or the graph line on C, and it responds to changes in oxygen as well as carbon dioxide and pH levels. So it's going to adjust the circulation. Again, these are all the fast acting mechanisms that respond. All right, then we have intermediate responses. All right, so minutes to hours. All right, so line D is basically when we're stressed or when we relax. So stress and relaxation, those vessels are going to expand or contract to accommodate those changes in blood pressure. So again, that happens in minutes to hours. All right, then we have the capillary fluid shift. All right, and that is the graph E, which is down here. All right, in terms of the capillary fluid shift, that means that the fluid is going to move between the capillaries and the interstitial space to stabilize the blood volume for us. All right, and then we have the renin angiotensin response, as well as the long-term responses. So again, this graph is basically showing us how these responses are categorized and how long it basically takes for those responses to take action. So in terms of the renin response, which was line F down here, basically that RAS system is going to activate when the blood pressure is too low, and that renin is going to convert those angiotensinogen to that angiotensin 2, and it is going to cause vasoconstriction and also sodium retention. All right, in terms of the long-term mechanism, things that would take hours to days to respond, basically blood pressure controlled over an extended period of time. G is showing us, which is down here, we have aldosterone, which basically it's responsible for increasing sodium and water retention in the kidneys, and also boosting our blood volume. All right, renal blood volume control is the last long term, and that one is on the curve H. And that one, basically, we have the kidneys adjusting the fluid excretion to maintain that homeostasis. So if the blood pressure drops, the kidneys are going to retain more water and more sodium in order to restore blood volume. So the key takeaway from this slide is basically immediate mechanisms like our baroreceptors, chemoreceptors, and our CNS response are going to act within seconds to attempt to stabilize a sudden blood pressure shift. All right, intermediate responses like capillary shifts and vasoconstriction are going to help sustain blood pressure within minutes to hours. And then our long-term control is going to depend on hormonal regulation by aldosterone and also the kidneys, ensuring that that fluid balance and sustained blood pressure are regulated. All right, now we're going to talk about atrial blood pressure. So basically measuring it and what it consists of. So blood pressure is basically an indicator of the cardiovascular health of a person. So it also helps us assess the circulatory efficiency and also heart function. So measuring blood pressure is typically measured using a sphygmomanometer. All right, that's a blood pressure cuff, and also a stethoscope. So in your lab this week, you should be working with taking blood pressure. So when the cuff is inflated, it's temporarily going to be stopping that person's blood flow through the artery. As air is gradually released from the cuff, the blood is going to begin to return to its flowing action, and it's going to produce a Korotkoff sound. All right, and that sound is going to help determine the systolic and the diastolic pressure or blood pressure of the patient. All right, the systolic pressure is the higher number in the blood pressure reading. So we're talking about the top number of the reading, and it represents the force of the blood against that arterial wall during that ventricular contraction. So we're talking about systole. All right, a normal systolic value is around 100 sorry 120 millimeters of mercury. All right, and it's written 120 mmHg. All right, in terms of your diastolic blood pressure, this is the lower number in your blood pressure reading, and it reflects the force exerted by the blood against the artery wall when the ventricles are relaxed. So we're talking about diastolic or diastole. All right, and this phase basically includes isovolumetric ventricular relaxation, where the heart is preparing for the next beat. A normal diastolic value in adults is around 80 millimeters of mercury. All right, so those are the normal ranges. All right, as far as your pulse pressure is concerned, pulse pressure is simply the difference between your systolic and your diastolic pressure. For example, if your blood pressure is 120 over 80, this is how we normally write it, the large number over the small number, then your pulse pressure is going to be 40 millimeters of mercury. When we're talking about difference, we're talking about math, subtraction. So 120 minus 80 is equal to 40. All right, and that is millimeters of mercury as well, Hg. All right, so a wider or narrower pulse pressure can indicate some sort of cardiovascular issue, such as stiff arteries or also shock. So the key takeaways here is blood pressure is a measurement that provides us an idea of your heart health. Your systolic pressure is a measure of the force during contraction, and your diastolic pressure is a measurement of the force during relaxation. So understanding the values are going to help us identify hypertension versus hypotension and overall circulatory function. Now this slide is just giving us an idea of how we're going to use that instrument called the sphygmomanometer. All right, again, it's used to measure blood pressure. A lot of times we just call it a blood pressure cuff. So we're talking about this thing right here that's on the patient's arm. All right, so here we're showing that the patient is having their manual blood pressure taken. So basically, and on the right side, it's a graph of the pressure changes. So a sphygmometer, again, consists of a cuff, and it also has a pressure gauge and an inflation bulb. And again, it's used to measure the systolic and the diastolic pressure in millimeters of mercury, so the patient's blood pressure. We'll also need a stethoscope when we're taking their blood pressure, and it's used to listen to those Korotkoff sounds, which indicate the blood flow changes. All right, so if we're giving you a step-by-step process, what would happen first is we would place the cuff on the patient's arm just above, a little bit above their artery, and we're going to inflate that cuff typically above the systolic pressure. So typically 160 millimeters of mercury or higher. All right, that is going to temporarily stop the blood from flowing through their brachial artery. At that point in time, we should hear no sound because the patient's blood flow is completely blocked in that area. Now, we are going to slowly start to release air from the bulb. It has like a little valve that we can release and kind of start releasing air. And we are listening as it's being inflated. The blood flow is going to start to return. And when the cuff pressure is equal to the systolic pressure, we are listening for that first Korotkov sound, which marks the systolic pressure. Again, typically a normal systolic pressure is 120 millimeters of mercury in a healthy adult. All right, next we are going to continue deflating slowly and continuing to listen for Korotkov sounds. So with that continued deflation, the blood turbidity is basically going to continue to produce that rhythmic Korotkov sound. All right, and we're continuing to listen to those sounds until we hear the very last Korotkov sound. And typically that's when that's when the cuff pressure is equal to the patient's diastolic pressure, which that normal range for the healthy adult was 80 millimeters of mercury. All right, that is approximately when we should hear that last Korotkov sound. All right, beyond that point, we have what we call laminar blood flow is going to resume, and we're not going to hear any more sounds. All right, so that is how we take the patient's blood pressure. So basically, how do we interpret this graph on the right? So it's basically showing the cuff pressure decreasing over time with key points marking systolic and also diastolic pressure readings. So systolic pressure, we're looking at approximately 120 millimeters of mercury is going to mark that first Korotkov sound. All right, and that is where this line is. And this also showing us the diastolic pressure at about 80 millimeters of mercury, which should mark approximately the end of the Korotkov sounds. And this is when blood is flowing normally at that point. All right, at this point and also at this point, we should not be hearing any sounds. All right, here there is no blood because we've cut off the blood flow. There's no blood pulsating through. All right, so again, in order to take the patient's blood pressure, you're going to need a sphygmomanometer or blood pressure cuff. All right, we need that to measure the arterial blood flow. The sounds that we're going to be listening for are the Korotkov sounds. And of course, we'll need a stethoscope in order to hear this. And again, that's going to help, those sounds are going to help us determine the systolic pressure. So the very first Korotkov sound that we're hearing as we deflate is going to mark the systolic pressure. And then the very last Korotkov sound that we hear as it's being deflated is going to mark the diastolic pressure. Now again, a normal reading is going to be around 120 over 80. All right, a normal healthy adult blood pressure, and any deviations from this can indicate that there's some sort of cardiovascular risk going on in terms of having high blood pressure or low blood pressure, which the professional term or the medical term for high blood pressure would be hypertension, and low blood pressure would be hypotension. All right, now we're going to discuss how different types of bleeding can affect a person's blood pressure. So the difference between arterial and venous bleeding. All right, you have to be able to understand and know what you're seeing, especially in an emergency situation. This is going to help determine the best approach to control the patient's bleeding. So arterial bleeding is coming directly from the heart. All right, so it's under very high pressure since the heart is contracting and relaxing in that rhythmic manner. That blood pressure is going to fluctuate and it leads to a spurting of blood from that injured artery. So each spurt basically is going to coincide with that person's heartbeat, and it makes arterial bleeding more dangerous due to the fact that they could be rapidly losing blood. All right, it's going to appear bright red in color, and of course we're talking about oxygen rich blood. So that bright red color indicates that the blood is rich in oxygen. All right, again, because of high pressure, arterial bleeding is going to be a lot harder to control because it's going to require direct pressure, also elevating that limb above the heart, and possibly a tourniquet in order to stop that type of bleeding. All right, the next type of bleeding is your venous bleeding. All right, and that is the blood that's returning to the heart. It's under a lot lower pressure, but it is a steady pressure. So this means that the blood flows out continuously, but it's not spurting like in the arterial bleeding. All right, the color is going to be a darker red. All right, so it's indicating that that blood is deoxygenated blood. So although venous bleeding is slower, if we're talking about large veins like the jugular vein, it can still lead to a significant loss of blood. So again, since that venous bleeding is it can be steady, but it's not spurting. It's a little bit easier to control with that direct pressure and bandaging versus the arterial bleeding where we've got that spurting action. All right, so the key takeaways, again, arterial bleeding is going to be a lot more urgent because of that rapid blood loss. All right, we do want to apply firm direct pressure, and we may need a tourniquet in order to cut off that blood flow. Venous bleeding is going to be steady, but it's usually can be controlled with just that direct pressure and the elevation. In terms of capillary bleeding, which we didn't mention, it's the least severe, and it appears as more of a slow oozing type bleed. All right, now let's focus on the concept of minute volume of blood, which basically we're talking about the total amount of blood that flows through the circulatory system in 1 minute. So some of the key factors that influence this are blood pressure gradient and also peripheral resistance. So to determine factors of minute volume, one of the things or some of the things that we have to think about is the greater the blood pressure gradient, the higher the blood flow. All right, in retro also in terms of peripheral resistance, which is caused by that vessel diameter and also blood viscosity, that is going to reduce the blood flow. So this balance basically determines the efficiency of circulation and also affects the oxygen and nutrients delivery. So we have something here called it's a French word, Pazoe flow, and also blood flow. So this we're basically introducing Pazoe's law here, which states that minute volume is equal to pressure gradient plus resistance. I'm sorry, minute volume is equal to pressure gradient divided by resistance. So if the pressure gradient increases, more blood is being pushed through the vessels. If resistance increases due to things such as vasoconstriction or plaque buildup or maybe even high viscosity, blood flow is going to decrease. So this equation basically helps us explain how the body adjusts circulation dynamically in response to some of these physiological needs. So in terms of clinical relevance in hypertension, resistance is high due to the fact that vasoconstriction is happening, and that is reducing the flow and also increasing that cardiac work load. In shock or low blood pressure, the pressure gradient is going to drop, leading to, of course, reduced organ perfusion. And then in terms of medications like our vasodilators, lower resistance is going to increase the blood flow. So vasoconstrictors are going to do the opposite of that. So again, vasodilators are going to open up those vessels and lower the resistance to increase the blood flow. So vasoconstrictors are going to increase the resistance by closing down on or closing the diameter of the vessels, and it is going to decrease the blood flow. So again, understanding the minute volume and what determines it is going to be essential for you to be able to manage some cardiovascular conditions. So again, if adjusting pressure and resistance is going to ensure that we have adequate blood supply to those organs under these various conditions. All right, this very busy picture basically shows us how multiple factors are going to influence our blood flow in the circulatory system. So the factors together are going to regulate blood volume, blood pressure, and also resistance to ensure that our tissues are getting proper perfusion. So the first one, we can look at blood volume regulation. All right, blood volume regulation is affected by our plasma volume, which can increase or decrease based on fluid intake and also the fluid loss. So key regulation of that includes the Starling's law that we talked about, also ADH as well, which is here, ANH, and also the RAS that we talked about. So in terms of that Starling's law of the capillaries, basically it governs fluid exchange between the capillaries and the interstitial tissues. All right, with the ADH, the aldosterone and also the ANH is basically going to control fluid loss and retention by changing some factors for us. All right, in terms of hemorrhage and also blood transfusion, if we are doing that, it can drastically alter our blood volume. So again, these are factors that are going to affect the blood flow. All right, in terms of venous return and also the stroke volume that we talked about, which is listed here, they are affected by factors such as gravity. Again, gravity affects blood distribution, especially when we're moving from a laying position to a stand position. We're laying down and we quickly stand up. Venous pumps as well, meaning those muscle contractions. The muscle contractions are going to push that blood back to the heart, and also physical activity is also going to affect the venous return and the stroke volume. Physical activity, we're talking about the venous return and the cardiac output. Now, we did learn that stroke volume is going to depend on that heart muscle contractility. So basically, it's regulated by epinephrine, or it can be regulated by epinephrine and also norepinephrine, which is here. In addition to that, this chart is showing us how blood pressure also contributes to the regulation of the blood flow. So cardiac output, which where we're looking at cardiac output here. All right, cardiac output is also going to affect the blood pressure, and it depends on a few things. So it depends on the arterial blood volume, which we discussed, and it also depends on the central venous pressure, which we discussed. And then it also depends on the blood pressure gradient, which is going to drive that circulation for us. Um, Peripheral resistance, which we also talked about, and peripheral resistance is determined by the arterial diameter. All right, so the diameter of the arterioles, which is smaller diameters are going to increase resistance and larger diameters are going to decrease resistance. And last but not least, blood viscosity. All right, blood viscosity, we're talking about thicker blood is going to move more slowly or more sluggish. All right, last but not least, hormonal changes and local control mechanisms, which are over here. All right, hormonal changes, we're talking about vasomotor reflexes. They're going to adjust the blood vessel tone in response. So if we're dealing with stress or our emotions or maybe even the baroreceptor signals, those vasochemoreflexes are going to kick in and detect those changes in our O2 and also the CO2 as well as the pH of our blood, and it's going to adjust the circulation for us as well. So in terms of the local mechanisms, they're going to help redirect the blood flow where it is needed most. So again, with the local mechanisms, the example we gave was if you put a rubber band on your hand to kind of restrict the blood flow. Whenever you take it off, you'll see the red color in your hand where the blood is trying to return or has been redirected to that area. So again, this flow chart just basically tells us how or shows us the various systems that work together to help maintain the blood flow under different physiological conditions. So again, this is just a visual for us to show that there's many different factors that can influence our blood flow. All right, now let's look at the relationship between blood flow velocity and the cross-section area of our blood vessels. So this is going to help us better explain why blood moves faster in different parts of our circulatory system. So the principle of fluid flow basically states that the velocity of a fluid such as blood inversely correlates with the total cross-section area of the vessel. So when a fluid moves from a narrow tube to a wider tube, it slows down because the same volume is spread over a larger area. So again, when the vessel diameter decreases, the velocity will increase. So blood flow in different vessels, blood flows slower through arterioles than arteries, and that's because that combined cross-section area of the arterioles is greater than that of the arteries. In capillaries, the velocity is even slower since they have the largest cross-section area. So this slow movement is definitely necessary because it's going to allow sufficient time for that gas exchange and nutrients diffusion to occur. All right, transition from capillaries to venules. So after passing through the capillaries, our blood enters venules. All right, the total cross-section area of our venules is actually smaller than that of the capillary. So the velocity actually increases slightly in venules before the blood returns back to the veins. So basically, the blood flows fastest in larger arteries and it slows down significantly in arterioles and capillaries, and then it speeds up again in venules and veins. So again, this type of dynamic regulation of velocity is basically what we need in order to maintain efficient circulation and also tissue perfusion. All right, so this slide is basically a continuation of the previous slide, and it's basically showing us how the blood flow changes as it moves through our circulatory system. So basically looking at the relationship between the cross-sectional area and the blood flow velocity and the different types of blood. So cross-sectional area and velocity in these we're looking at the cross-sectional area and velocity in these different vessels. So arteries and arterioles have a small total cross-section area. So blood flows in them at high velocity in the vessels. So as blood enters the capillaries, the total cross-sectional area dramatically increases, and that leads to a significant decrease in the velocity, meaning the blood is moving slower. After passing through the capillaries, blood enters the venules and veins where the cross-sectional area decreases again, and that leads to an increase in the velocity. So basically, why the importance of, when we're talking about the importance of low velocity in capillaries, the capillaries are the site where that gas exchange and nutrients delivery as well as the waste removal occurs. So this process, in order for it to occur efficiently, the blood needs to move slowly through those capillaries, allowing enough time for that exchange to take place. All right, then we transition from the arteries to the veins. All right, and blood starts at a high velocity in the arteries and it slows down in the capillaries, and then it speeds back up again as it moves into the veins. And this ensures that that oxygenated blood is going to reach the tissues efficiently, while the deoxygenated blood is going to be returned efficiently to the heart. So again, the body circulatory system is designed to regulate this blood flow depending on the function and how fast it flows for transport and how slow it flows in terms of exchange. So when I look at this chart, I kind of had to take a moment to understand what was going on here. So the image is basically comparing the three main types of our blood vessels. So on the left we have the arteries and the arterioles. In the middle we have the capillaries, and on the right we have the veins and the venules. So the size of the tubes in the image basically represent the total cross-section area of the vessels of the body. So it still didn't really make sense to me because we're talking about arteries and I feel like they should be larger. But the reason why arteries have a smaller cross section is because arteries, if you remember in the beginning of the lecture, we looked at how thick the walls of the arteries were. All right, and because of their thickness, that makes for a smaller total cross section area because they're designed to carry blood quickly under high pressure. Basically, like when we talked about when we lower the cross section area, things move a little bit faster. Let's say if I put my thumb over a water hose, the water is going to spurt out at a farther distance. So think of them like basically, I'll say a freeway with a few wide lanes. Blood moves fast because the space is limited, but the pressure is still high. So again, their job is to rapidly distribute oxygenated blood from the heart to the rest of the body. Now, why do capillaries have the largest cross section? And capillaries, they're tiny, but we have a lot of them. So they're high in number, meaning their total area in the body is very large. And this is necessary because those capillaries are where that gas and nutrients exchange takes place. So the large cross section or total cross section area causes the blood to slow down, giving more time for that oxygen and nutrients to move into our tissues. So again, this is why I can better understand what this picture is trying to show us. So veins, they have what we would consider the medium cross-section area. So veins need to return the blood to the heart, but since the blood has lost most of its pressure, the veins have a thinner wall and a larger diameter to accommodate the slower movement of blood. So the total cross-sectional area decreases compared to that of capillaries, so the blood is forced to increase speed in order to move back to the heart. All right, so the key takeaway here is arteries have the smallest cross-section area because the blood moves fast and under high pressure, has thicker walls. Capillaries have the largest cross-section area to slow the blood down for that gas exchange and nutrients exchange. And the veins have a medium cross-section area to help return the blood back to the heart. This diagram just expands on the previous slide that we looked at by showing us the relationship between the blood vessel types, the cross-sectional area, and also the blood flow velocity in our circulatory system. So the top portion of the chart shows us the different types of blood vessels. So aorta, arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, veins, and vena cava. The yellow background represents the total cross-sectional area of these blood vessels, and then the red line at the bottom represents the velocity of the blood flow in milliliters per second through each vessel type. All right, so when we look at the chart, when we're looking at the arteries and the arterioles, again, we said that the cross-section, due to the fact that they had those thick muscle walls, that has a small total cross-sectional area. And also we have very few large vessels. So within these vessels, the blood is moving very fast, and that's due to the high pressure from the heart pumping. All right, so arteries, they act kind of like freeways or highways. That blood is moving rapidly to the tissues. All right, the middle section, we're looking at the capillaries. All right, and the capillaries, they have the largest total cross-sectional area, and that's because we have millions of tiny capillaries throughout our body, and the blood is moving or flowing slowest through the capillaries. The reason why we need it to move slowly or slow down is because the capillaries are where the oxygen, nutrients, and the waste are exchanged. So this means that it needs time for that diffusion to happen. So again, the blood is moving slowest through the capillaries. All right, and last but not least, we have the veins and also the vena cava on the right side. All right, and this is decreases, the blood flow decreases as blood moves back to the heart. However, it is faster than how it is moving through the capillaries, but slower than it was as it was moving through the arteries. So again, blood speeds up again as those vessels merge back together into those larger veins. So even though veins have a lower pressure, they do have a wider diameter, and the muscle contractions are what help push the blood back to the heart, as well as those one-way valves that are within the veins. So again, arteries have a high velocity and a lower cross section. It allows for fast transport of blood. Capillaries have a low velocity and a high cross section, which allows for time for exchange of nutrients and gases. And then the veins have a moderate velocity and a moderate cross section, which allows for the return of the blood to the heart. All right, now we're talking about pulse mechanism, which is basically a physiological and also clinical marker to a patient's cardiovascular health. So the pulse is a direct reflection of how that blood is moving through the arteries and also how the heart is maintaining circulation. So in terms of clinical significance, a pulse assessment is going to provide us with critical information about the heart function, the blood vessels, and also overall circulation. Changes in your patient's pulse rate, the strength of it, and also the rhythm can indicate conditions like shock, dehydration, heart failure, and also vascular disease. So physicians and nurses like you are going to frequently check the pulse in order to monitor a person's health. So, physiological significance here is in terms of arterial expansion and recoil. When the heart contracts, we're talking about systole, the blood is pushed into the arteries, causing them to expand. All right, during heart relaxation, which is diastole, the elastic arteries recoil and help maintain continuous blood flow. So even when the heart is not actively pumping, it does this. So this elasticity is going to conserve energy and also ensure smooth circulation rather than sudden bursts of blood flow. All right, so two key factors for pulse existence is listed here. And that is basically alternating pressure changes. So blood is pushed into the arteries during systole, increasing the pressure, and blood moves forward as the pressure drops during diastole. So this rhythmic fluctuation is basically what generates the pulse wave. So we feel that pulse at different pulse points. All right. Arterial wall elasticity is going to be important. Healthy arteries are going to be allowed to stretch and recoil efficiently, maintaining that blood flow. If our arteries become stiff or less elastic due to things such as aging, hypertension, or some sort of disease, the pulse is going to become weaker and maybe even irregular. So the pulse is basically a useful diagnostic tool in order for us to determine what the patient's health condition is. A strong regular pulse is an indicator of good cardiovascular health. And if there's any abnormalities in the pulse rate or strength, it can signal that there might be some sort of underlying health condition. All right, so this is why we regularly do pulse checks on our patients. All right, now we're looking at the normal carotid pulse wave, and it basically represents the pressure changes in the carotid artery during the cardiac cycle. So the carotid pulse, again, we said we're going to use it as a diagnostic tool to assess cardiac function, blood pressure regulation, and also some vascular health. We can look at this using this as a tool. So now we're going to look at these pulse wave components. So the first thing that we're going to look at is the upstroke. All right, so where it says systole. So that sharp rise in the wave represents that ventricular contraction. All right, again, that's systole. So as the left ventricle is contracting, blood is being forcefully ejected into the aorta and also the carotid arteries. All right, and that is causing a pressure increase. All right, that pressure increase is what creates that systolic peak in that pulse wave. All right, then we have a downstroke. All right, the downstroke after systole is the pressure in the artery as it begins to fall as the heart is relaxing, and that is diastole there. All right, so the blood does continue to flow due to that elastic recoil in the arteries, and that's going to ensure that we have continuous circulation there. So that diastolic portion of the wave basically represents that gradual drop in pressure. Now, there is also the dicrotic notch there, all right, and that occurs based on the fact that the aortic valves are closing. When the aortic valves close, we do have a brief increase in the pressure happening, but it does gradually decline after that. So the notch is useful in determining or assessing valve function and also overall arterial health. So a normal pulse wave is going to follow this particular pattern that we're looking at. And it's going to basically tell us that we have adequate blood flow and oxygen delivery. If we have any abnormal waveforms, it can indicate that the person might have some sort of valve disorder specifically aortic valve disorder. Maybe there's stenosis there, or maybe there's regurgitation. It can also represent heart failure, weak or dampened pulses, and also arterial stiffness or hypertension, meaning they have a widened pulse wave. So again, your physicians can look at or analyze these pulse waves using ultrasound, Doppler ultrasound, or palpation techniques to diagnose your cardiovascular health. All right, again, that systolic peak and the diastolic downstroke, as well as that dicrotic notch, are going to be key indicators of your heart performance, and also that arterial elasticity that we've been talking about. All right, now we're looking at the functional role of the pulse wave. So in the top picture, or the blue picture, we're looking at the expansion phase, and in the bottom picture, we're looking at the recoil phase. So what is actually happening in this picture is we have the heart in systole. So basically, the heart is contracting. All right, as the heart is contracting, blood is being ejected into the aorta and also the arteries, causing them to expand due to that sudden increase in pressure. So the elastic walls of those arteries are going to stretch, storing some of that energy from that heartbeat. All right, the semilunar valve, or the aortic valve, is open, and it's going to allow that blood to move forward. All right, in the recoil phase, which is at the bottom, the heart is now in diastole. So the ventricles are now relaxing. The semilunar, or the aortic valve, is now going to close to prevent that blood from backflowing into the heart. The arterial walls are going to recoil, using some of that stored elastic energy to push that blood forward into those smaller arteries and capillaries. So this basically smooths out the blood flow, ensuring that we have that continuous circulation even when the heart is not actively pumping. So the image basically, it visually represents how that arterial elasticity is going to help maintain that stable blood flow between the beats. So the expansion and the recoil mechanisms is going to be or is critical for that efficient circulation. It also prevents the blood pressure from dropping too low during that diastolic phase. Now, again, in terms of that pulse wave, it's generated by the heart's contraction in that systole, and also the relaxation during diastole. And it's also propagated, meaning continued throughout the artery. So again, in systole, or the expansion phase, what's happening is the ventricles contracting, forcing that blood out through that semilunar valve. Another word for semilunar valve is aortic valve, and that rapid ejection of that blood is causing the aorta and the arteries to expand, temporarily storing what we call kinetic energy in those elastic walls of the arteries. That expansion is definitely essential for maintaining that continuous blood flow, even during the relaxation phase of the heart. All right, again, arteries, especially the aorta and the major branches, act as those pressure reservoirs, stretching to accommodate that high pressure surge. Now, during that recoil phase, again, what's happening is the ventricle is going to relax. Again, we're talking about diastole, causing that aortic valve to shut. That elastic recoil, so think about that rubber band again, the elastic recoil of those arteries is going to push that stored blood forward, propelling it through the circulatory system. So again, this mechanism is going to prevent that blood pressure from dropping too low, and ensuring that our tissues are going to have continuous perfusion happening between the beats. So the recoil phase is what smooths out our blood flow, preventing it from being a series of just pulses, instead of that steady flow that we need. All right, so again, clinical relevance here is the efficiency or that arterial elasticity is necessary. So things such as aging and arteriosclerosis, anything that stiffens the arteries are going to reduce that arterial compliance or the recoil that it needs, making our blood flow a little bit less efficient and increasing the workload on our heart. So again, any loss in elasticity is going to lead to a higher systolic blood pressure because the arteries can't expand as easily. All right, this is basically us finishing up talking about the pulse wave. Again, that's the wave is basically a mechanical wave that's generated by that ventricular contraction. Again, it travels through the arteries as a wave or expansion and a recoil following each heartbeat. So, in terms of propagation of that pulse wave, meaning how it happens, it starts at the heart when blood is ejected into the aorta. So the elastic arteries expand, and of course, they absorb the force of that blood surging in. As the wave moves further away from the heart, it's going to lose some of its energy due to resistance of those arterial walls, and then we will see the wave start to dissipate. So as the wave reaches those smaller arteries or arterioles and capillaries, the force is going to basically diminish. So by the time blood reaches the capillaries, the pulse wave has disappeared due to the loss of pressure and also the increased resistance that is there. So again, the pulse wave is going to give us an idea of the cardiovascular function and also the arterial elasticity. In healthy arteries, the wave should move smoothly and steadily. In arteries that have lost some sort of elasticity due to hypertension or atherosclerosis, the pulse wave may travel faster or become very irregular. All right, as a nurse or a healthcare professional, you may need to take a patient's pulse. All right, so where can the pulse be felt? The arterial pulse can be felt in locations where an artery basically is lying close to the surface and is positioned typically over a bone or some other firm structure. So it allows for us to easily compress that artery, making the pulse more noticeable. So some of the common pulse points that we're going to talk about are the radial artery, are found in the radial artery, the carotid artery, our brachial artery, the femoral artery, and also the dorsalis pedis artery. The venous pulse can also be taken, but unlike the arterial pulses, the venous pulse it's rarely felt. So it's usually detectable only in large veins, primarily those near the heart, such as the jugular vein, and also in the no, basically in that one near the heart. So um, it's again only detectable in those large veins. So primarily just the vein near the heart, which is our jugular vein. All right, the jugular venous pulse. It can provide us with some clinical insight into right atrial pressure and heart function as well. So, venous pulses are not clinically significant for routine assessments compared to the arterial pulses. So, arterial pulses, they're usually strong and rhythmic due to the heart's contraction. And venous pulses, on the other hand, they're going to lack that strong force because veins don't experience that same pulsative pressure that the arteries have based on that pressure that's inside of them. All right, again, the pulse is the rhythmic expansion and recoil of the artery due to the heart contracting. So it can be felt or palpated in areas where the arteries run close to the skin and typically over a bone. So the pulse points are, good for clinical assessments on heart rate, blood flow, and also circulation. So some of the common pulse locations and their significance are listed here. So the radial artery, which is in the wrist, that is a very common, probably the most commonly used point, because it is easily accessible. So if you put your fingers, not the thumb though, on the radial artery, which is on the thumb side at the wrist, you can feel your radial pulse. All right, another pulse area is the temporal artery. So in front of the ear or on the outer side of the eye, you can feel the temporal artery, and it's used for checking circulation in the head. All right, another area where the pulse can be checked is the common carotid artery. So it is at the anterior edge of our sternocleidomastoid muscle of the neck. All right, so it basically provides a very strong pulse there, and we can commonly check that pulse during emergency. So if you've ever learned CPR, that is an area where we check the pulse rate on the patient. All right, the next one that can be felt is our facial artery. All right, so that is at the lower margin of our lower jawbone. We can also use that one in some medical assessments for facial circulation. All right, another artery where the pulse can be felt is the brachial artery. So that is the bend in the elbow, so the inner margin of our bicep muscle area. All right, that one is another area that's important for measuring blood pressure as well, but we can also feel the pulse there. All right, another one is our femoral artery. So it's in the middle of our groin. So that one's not one that we normally assess, on a regular daily basis as, let's say, a medical professional, but you can assess it there because blood, that is basically we can assess to check if blood is flowing to our lower extremities. All right, and the last one that is listed here is the popliteal artery that is behind the knee. That one is a little bit more difficult to locate, but it can be an area that we can assess when we're evaluating for circulation in the legs. So again, assessing the circulation by checking the pulse, we're ensuring that blood is actually reaching those different parts of the body. So this is probably a vital sign that you will normally check. The heart rate and also the rhythm, we can assess it by using the pulse and also the blood pressure that we learned earlier. So again, in emergency situations, the carotid and sometimes the femoral pulses are preferred for checking the patient, especially if we're talking about cardiac arrest. All right, so we learned about arterial bleeding a little bit earlier, and arterial bleeding meaning the person is bleeding from an artery that has been severed, and it's considered more dangerous than the venous bleeding because those arteries are carrying that oxygen-rich blood. It's under great pressure, so the blood is spurting out. So blood is being lost at a very rapid pace, and it can be very life-threatening if we don't get it under control quickly. So typically applying direct pressure at a specific pressure point can help slow it down and sometimes stop the bleeding by compressing on an artery that is against the bone. So here listed is some of the key pressure points for stopping the arterial bleeding, and there's 6 of them. All right, the first one is the temporal artery. So that is basically in front of the ear. So we can use that pressure point in order to stop bleeding in the scalp and also the forehead. All right, the next one is a facial artery. All right, same area that we would check the pulse. and it's useful for bleeding in or stopping the bleeding in the face area. All right, another important pressure point is the common carotid artery. All right, and press up against the spinal column. All right, we can use it can be used for stopping severe neck bleeding, but of course we do need to use caution with that one and avoid cutting off circulation to the brain if we're trying to use that one. All right, another one is the subclavian artery. So that one is behind the medial third of our clavicle. All right, so pressing against our first rib. All right, it can help stop bleeding in our upper chest or our shoulder area. Another one is the brachial artery just inside of our arm. So if we are pressing it on it against the humerus, we can control severe bleeding in the arm and also the forearm. And the last one is the femoral artery. All right, so that's in the middle of the groin. If we press it against the pelvic bone, especially if the person has like a critical leg injury, or we need to stop bleeding in the femoral area, we can use that particular artery. Femoral bleeding can be very dangerous. A person can die in minutes if they're bleeding from that femoral artery. So again, in terms of stopping the bleeding, if we're using a pressure point, we're going to apply firm pressure with our fingers or our hands if we need to occlude that blood flow. So we need to stop the blood flow. If that is not working, we may need to use a tourniquet or apply a tourniquet, especially if we're talking about a limb bleeding, or maybe the limb has been severed. We may need to use a tourniquet as a last resort. Once you put the tourniquet on, you cannot take it off. The medical team, whomever the surgeon, will need to be the one that takes it off. So EMS and also other healthcare professionals, again, they are trained and they use these techniques in emergencies such as traumas, deep cuts, and also maybe patients with gunshot wounds to help stop the bleeding, especially if we're talking about arterial bleeding. All right, we talked a little bit about pulse points, and in terms of pulse, we're talking about that expansion and recoil of the artery due to the pumping action of the heart. So the pulse points are areas, again, where arteries are close to the skin, and they can be pressed against a bone in order to feel our heartbeat. So the reason why these are clinically significant, because we use these points to check circulation, assess overall cardiovascular health, and we can also use them to stop arterial bleeding if we need to. So we already talked about these, but now we're looking at them visually. So your superficial temporal artery, which is located in front of the ear, useful for assessing head trauma and also scalp circulation. We have the facial artery, which runs along the lower jaw. Again, good for checking pulse in dental or maxillofacial trauma. We have the carotid artery there found along the neck. That's the most commonly used one in emergency situations. So if you were giving CPR, that's the one that you would use to check the pulse. We have the subclavian artery located below the clavicle, again critical for upper body circulation, so we could check it there, or of course we could stop the bleeding with that one as well. Axillary artery in the armpit, used when the brachial pulse is difficult to assess. We can use that one. The brachial artery, so that's the inner arm. We commonly use that one for measuring blood pressure and also assessing circulation in infants. The radial artery is located in our wrist. That's the most commonly used pulse point for just routine heart rate checks. Patient comes in for a routine checkup. The femoral artery found in the groin, it's important for checking like lower limb circulation, especially in trauma cases. The popliteal artery, which is behind the knee, that one is also useful in assessing leg circulation, especially in cases where we suspect that the person might have peripheral artery disease that could potentially lead to deep vein thrombosis. The posterior tibial artery, that one's located near the ankle. That one is used to evaluate foot circulation. And then the last one is the dorsalis pedis artery found on top of the foot. That one's another key pulse point for assessing peripheral circulation. So again, these are points that we can use to check the patient's pulse. Again, we can monitor their heart rate and rhythm by using these points. We can assess their blood flow after an injury or after some type of surgery or even before surgery. And we can also identify circulation issues such as arterial blockages or also shock. So again, medically, if we're using a pulse point, let's say we come across an unconscious patient, we need to give CPR. The one we would most often use would be the carotid pulse. For bleeding control, of course, we can use some of these pressure points, like the brachial and the femoral artery to stop bleeding. And then for peripheral pulses, the dorsalis pedis and also the posterior tibial pulse point could be used to detect poor circulation in diabetic patients. All right, now let's look at circulatory shock. So circulatory shock, it is a life-threatening condition, and it's basically where the body's organs and tissues are not receiving enough blood flow. So this leads to oxygen deprivation, causing cellular damage and also potential organ failure if not treated. So shock can result from things such as heart failure, blood loss, infections, allergic reactions. Also, nervous system dysfunction can cause shock. So it is important that we recognize the type of shock so that we can provide the patient with the appropriate treatment. So the types of circulatory shock that are listed here, the first one is cardiogenic shock. All right, cardiogenic shock is caused by heart failure. So basically where the heart is unable to pump enough blood to meet our body's needs. So some common causes include things such as a heart attack, arrhythmias, and also severe heart diseases can cause this. Some signs of cardiogenic shock could be low blood pressure, weak pulse, cold, clammy skin, and also the patient might have shortness of breath. If a person goes into cardiogenic shock, some treatment would be medications to improve the heart function, of course, oxygen therapy, or they may need some sort of mechanical support. All right, the next one is hypovolemic shock. So this one occurs due to a severe loss of blood, or it can be fluids, and that leads to a drop in the blood volume and also the pressure. So causes of this could be severe bleeding, dehydration, burns can cause this, fluid loss from vomiting, and also diarrhea. So hypovolemic shock, some of the signs of it are rapid heartbeat, low blood pressure. The patient might be confused. They may have pale skin as well. And treatment for this one would typically be some sort of fluid replacement, whether it be IV fluids or whether it's a blood transfusion. And also, we have to, if the person is bleeding, we need to stop the source of the bleeding. All right, the next one is neurogenic shock. So it's caused by some sort of damage to our nervous system, and it leads to a loss in the patient's vascular tone, and also we would have widespread vasodilation. So common causes of this type of shock could be spinal cord injury, a nervous system disorder, and also some types of brain injuries or brain trauma can cause this. And signs of this would be bradycardia. So basically the patient's heart rate is going to slow down. They're going to have low blood pressure, and also they may have warm, dry skin, and that's due to that vasodilation. If the patient is going into this type of shock, treatment means maybe IV fluids, vasopressors to help constrict the blood vessels, and also some type of supportive care for the patient. All right, the next one is anaphylactic shock. So the person has a severe allergic reaction to something that causes widespread vasodilation. Their airway is going to typically constrict and their blood pressure is going to drop. So common triggers that might spin a person into anaphylactic shock are going to be food allergies, insect stings, sometimes medications can cause this. And believe it or not, since you're working in the medical field, you need to know if you are allergic to latex. So if you have a latex exposure, it could turn into, if not treated, anaphylactic shock. So difficulties, signs of this one would be difficulty breathing. Of course, they would have swelling, especially in the throat. They may have hives, and of course, they would experience a rapid drop in their blood pressure. If they are in anaphylactic shock, typically, if the person has some type of allergies, they usually carry around, if they're diagnosed, an EpiPen. So epinephrine is a treatment. Antihistamines, corticosteroids are also treatment, and also oxygen therapy as well. And septic shock is the last one, and that occurs due to some sort of severe infection, whether it's bacterial infection or whether it's a viral infection. It leads to widespread inflammation within their body. Also, it can lead to organ damage and also vasodilation. Some things that can cause this are pneumonia, UTIs or urinary tract infections, and also bloodstream infections. This person may present with a high fever, a rapid heart rate, of course, a low blood pressure, and they also might be confused. All right, if they are in septic shock, some of the treatment ranges from IV antibiotics, fluids, and also vasopressors to maintain that blood pressure. So basically, in terms of any type of shock, we need to be able to recognize it early so that that patient can get the treatment that we need or they need. All right, that is going to prevent that person from going into organ failure, and it can be multiple organ systems failing. All right, different types of shock are going to require specific interventions based on their cause. So again, when the patient presents and we identify it and start the treatment, we will be continuing to monitor their vital signs. They may receive oxygen therapy, and they also may have medications onboarded as well. All right, now let's look at basically the difference between hypertension and hypotension. All right, hypertension is basically, if we're going to give it a definition, it's defined as a consistent blood pressure of 140 over 90 millimeters of mercury or higher. All right, so some of the causes and risk factors of hypertension are going to be, it can be primary hypertension, which basically there's no identified cause. It's typically influenced by the person's genetics, their age, their lifestyle, diet, obesity, smoking, things of that nature. And then we can also have secondary hypertension. Secondary hypertension is due to an underlying condition like kidney disease, some sort of endocrine disorder, or maybe even medication use. Now, there are stages of hypertension. We go from stage 1 to stage 2, and then, of course, they can have a hypertensive crisis. Stage 1 hypertension is typically, again, we talked about the normal blood pressure for an adult. We said it was 120 over 80 earlier in our lecture. So stage 1 hypertension is anything that's 130 to 139 over 80 to 89. All right, again, normal was 120 over 80. All right, so stage 1 hypertension is 130 to 139 over 80 to 89. Stage 2 hypertension is 140 plus over 90 plus. So 140 plus anything over 140 and anything over 90. All right. Now, if a person is going into what we call a hypertensive crisis, that means that their blood pressure is over. It's 180 over 120. All right, 180 over 120. This puts them in hypertensive crisis, meaning they require immediate emergency care. All right, complications that can occur if hypertension is left untreated. Of course, the patient could potentially have a stroke, a heart attack. They can go into kidney failure. They can experience vision loss, and also they can have an aneurysm due to the force and the pressure that is continuously exerted on their arteries. So, in terms of management and treatment of hypertension, sometimes we can treat it with lifestyle modifications. So, reducing sodium intake. So, we're talking about salt. Exercise. If you smoke, maybe quit smoking. And also managing stress. So, those are some lifestyle changes. All right, but sometimes lifestyle changes don't work, or we can use them in conjunction with medication. So, some of the medications that people with hypertension might take are diuretics, beta blockers, ACE inhibitors, and also calcium channel blockers. All right, the next category is hypotension. All right, so low blood pressure. All right, it occurs when the blood pressure is too low, reducing blood flow to our organs. So some types of hypotension are acute hypotension. So we have a sudden drop due to something like shock, dehydration, or blood loss, or maybe even a side effect of some sort of medication. And we can also have chronic hypotension. All right, basically, this is genetic, or it can be linked to something like heart disease, a nervous system dysfunction, or endocrine disorders. Or we can have postural hypertension. So this is going back to that orthostatic hypertension that we talked about earlier, when you're in a you're laying down and you get up too quickly. When we do that, sometimes we have a sudden drop in our blood pressure when we stand, and that causes us to be dizzy. So again, the signs of the orthostatic hypotension are going to be dizziness. That person could actually faint. They might have blurred vision and also fatigue. All right, and shock in severe cases can occur. So management of this would be increase the fluid and salt intake, wear compression stockings, and also avoid those sudden positional changes. Medications like um, fluorocortisone can also be used in severe cases. All right, so some of the takeaways from hypertension and hypotension. In terms of hypertension, it is considered to be a silent killer because sometimes it has no symptoms until the complications arise. Hypotension can also be dangerous as well when it results in inadequate organ perfusion. All right, so regular blood pressure monitoring, especially if you've been diagnosed with either, is critical in detection of both of these, and also um, treatment or prevention of both of these. So, as a healthcare professional, you will be educating your patients, especially if they present with borderline hypertension, meaning that stage 1 or even stage 2, you're going to be educating them on things such as lifestyle changes that can significantly reduce their risk. Also, in terms of the reason why this is significant. So this is basically when we introduce blood pressure regulation. So blood pressure is basically that force that's exerted on our blood, the exerted by the blood against our arterial walls. Again, it's measured in millimeters of mercury, and it's recorded as the systolic pressure over the diastolic pressure, all right, which is the big number over this small number. Again, we said that our normal blood pressure as an adult is around 120 over 80. That's the normal blood pressure. So again, when the blood pressure becomes too high in the case of hypertension, or even when it becomes too low in terms of hypertension, it can lead to health complications. So it's essential for us, especially if we are taking our and assessing our patients' blood pressure as they're coming in, to ensure that we're doing it correctly so that we can um, treat the patient in the event that they have high blood pressure, or their pressure is too low and they're experiencing medical issues due to that as well. All right, so this is the end of our chapter. And this chapter again was on the circulation of blood. So thanks for dropping in. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible.